Welcome back, everyone. Oh, it's been entirely too long since we've read something trashy together. And since I'll be on vacation next Saturday, I figured now's a good week for exactly that. Now, I'm always on the hunt for something entertainingly bad, and there's an art to something laughable but not so bad you put it down. Well, I've been introduced to a franchise that seems to start as one and then it devolves into the other, with the Chronicles of Gor novels by John Norman. I'm fascinated by things I just discovered that turn out to have been long running franchises, and the first one, which I'll be reading, The Tarnsman of Gor, was written in 1966. The series then continued on for a scale breaking 33 more installments, the last of which was written just this year. The author, born here in Chicago, is a philosophy professor from Princeton and was born in 1931 and he's still alive and writing today. I mean, you think George R.R. Martin has taken his sweet time? This dude's 93 and still cranking these things out, which, whatever we can say about the quality of the work, fucking goals, man. Anyway, Gore is his primary contribution to literature, and what a contribution it is. Sword and Planet's barbarian fantasy set in the titular world of Gore, which is a secret planet in our solar system very much like Earth. This goes places. Gore is permanently locked on the far side of the sun, so we somehow never noticed it, which scientifically impossible, but never mind. And the first book starts with our everyman protagonist yoinked off world to go have cool adventures on this one. This is isekai before isekai was trendy, right down to our hero becoming impossibly skilled at melee combat and getting a sex slave basically for existing. Yeah, that's where this gets weird and a little uncomfortable. From what I can tell, this series is a thinly veiled attempt by the author to explore various BDSM and master-slave kinks, resulting in a caste system with women basically on the bottom rung. Our protagonist starts off shocked by this, but eventually becomes an ever more enthusiastic participant as the series gets more overt and schlocky about it. You can imagine where it goes from there, and no, he doesn't fix the cable. Just the Wikipedia summary gives me enough material to drink all night. It's the kind of stuff that leaves experienced practitioners seething. I'm not even going to touch the quote-unquote philosophy this apparently spawned, which I can only describe as the love child of Ayn Rand and 4chan, right down to blaming feminism for declining sales in the 80s. It's possible the planet is located in one of Earth's Lagrange points. That's fair. I'm sure there's some funky way that is technically possible, but probably was not thought of here. Anyway, the TLDR is that it sounds like a hot mess. Overwrought prose, cartoonishly sexist, 50 Shades of Grey tier poor understanding of the fetishes in question. There's some debate, apparently, over whether the first started as genre parody that became an unironic example when they changed publishers. Regardless, I'm intrigued, which brings us to our challenge. The goal is simply to read it without laughing or cringing at something uncomfortable. Every time I do either, I drink. Now, this isn't sloppy writing like in The Eye of Argon, or intentionally bad like Atlanta Nights. Will someone breast boobily? Oh, quite possibly, Stochastic Dragon. Good to have you here. But yeah, this isn't like The Eye of Argon or Atlanta Nights, but from my brief perusal, its earnestness and effort only makes it more difficult to get through. If you'd like to follow along, I'll be posting a link in chat for a copy of the text. The site appears to be legit, but do let me know if there are any issues. Just a second here. And there. Alright. Without further ado, I bring you The Tarnsman of Gor by John Norman. By the surly beard of Mrifk, we begin. Tarnsman of Gor, Chronicles of Counter-Earth, Number 1. By John Norman, 1931, published 1966. Chapter 1. A Handful of Earth. Actually, let's start off with a drink. I have a Weihenstephaner Helles. It's basically a tall boy imported from Germany. Alright, let's go ahead and increment that. Alright, Chapter 1, A Handful of Earth. My name is Tarl Cabot. The name is supposed to have been shortened in the 15th century from the Italian surname Caboto. As far as I know, however, I have no connection with a Venetian explorer who carried the banner of Henry VII to the New World. Such a connection seems unlikely for a number of reasons, among them the fact that my people were simple tradesmen of Bristol, and uniformly fair-complexioned, and topped with a blaze of the most outrageous red hair. Shit. Oh, I'm already started on this. I don't know, something about that. Just uniformly fair-complexioned. Listening to him read this while solving a metaprogramming problem where an AI has to write and cache code for itself to optimize the math issue. Oh, Lord. And I thought I had a tough job. Anyway, Let's see. Where was I? Nonetheless, such coincidences, even if they are only geographical, linger in our family memory. Our small challenge to the ledgers and arithmetic of an existence measured in bolts of cloth sold. I like to think there may have been a Cabot in Bristol, one of us, who watched our Italian namesake weigh anchor in the early morning of that 2nd May, 1497. You may remark on my first name, and I assure you that it gave me quite as much trouble as it might you, particularly during my early school years, when it occasioned almost as many contests of physical skill as my red hair. Let us say simply that it is not a common name, not common on this world of ours. It was given to me by my father, who disappeared when I was quite young. I thought him dead until I received his strange message, more than 20 years after he had vanished. My mother, whom he inquired after, had died when I was about 6, somewhere about the time I entered school. Biographical details are tedious, you don't say, so suffice to say that I was a bright child, fairly large for my age, and was given a credible upbringing by an aunt who furnished everything that a child might need, with the possible exception of love. Surprisingly enough, I managed to gain entrance to the University of Oxford, but I shall not choose to embarrass my colleague by entering its somewhat too revered name into this narrative. College, I'm sorry. College, not colleague. I graduated decently, having failed to astound either myself or my tutors. Like a large number of young men, I found myself passively educated, able to parse a sentence or so in Greek, and familiar enough with the abstractions of philosophy and economics to know that I would not be likely to fit into that world which they claimed to bear some obscure relation. I was not, however, reconciled to ending up on the shelves of my aunt's shop, along with the cloth and ribbon, and so I embarked upon a wild, but not too wild, adventure, all things considered. Yeah, even the isekai protagonist was a loser. Yeah, I am definitely getting some author self-insert here. But anyway, being literate and not too dull, and having read enough history to tell the Renaissance from the Industrial Revolution, I applied to several small American colleges for an instructorship in history. English history, of course. I told them I was somewhat more advanced academically than I was, and they believed me. And my tutors, in their letters of recommendation, being good fellows, were kind enough not to disabuse them of this illusion. I believe my tutors thoroughly enjoyed the situation, which they, naturally, did not allow me to know that they understood. It was the Revolutionary War all over again. One of the colleges to which I applied, one perhaps somewhat less perceptive than the rest, a small liberal arts college for men in New Hampshire, entered into negotiations, and I had soon received what was to be my first and I suppose my last appointment in the academic world. In tune, I assumed I would be found out, but meanwhile I had my passage to America paid and a position for at least 1 year. Hey, Kirby. I admit I was annoyed. Hang on a second. This outcome struck me as being a pleasant if perplexing state of affairs. I admit I was annoyed by the suspicion that I had been given the appointment largely on the grounds that I would be faculty exotica. Surely I have no publications, and I am confident there must have been several candidates from American universities whose credentials and capacities would have far outshone my own, except for the desiderated. Huh. I've never actually seen that before. Desiderated. Desiderated. British accent. I'm going to assume it means some kind of distinction or something of note. Yes, there would be the round of teas and the cocktail and the supper invitations. I liked America very much, though I was quite busy the first semester, smashing through numerous texts in an undignified manner, attempting to commit enough English history to memory to keep at least a reign or so ahead of my students. I discovered, to my dismay, that being English does not automatically qualify one as an authority on English history. Fortunately, my departmental chairman, a gentle, bespectacled man, whose specialty was American economic history, knew even less than I did, or at least was considerate enough to allow me to believe so. The Christmas vacation helped greatly. I was especially counting on the time between semesters to catch up, or better, to lengthen my lead on my students. Sorry, Kirby, I don't hate the British that much. But after the term papers, the tests, and the grading of the first semester, I was afflicted with a rather irresistible desire to chuck the British Empire and go for a long, long walk indeed, even a camping trip in the nearby White Mountains. I borrowed some camp gear, mostly a knapsack and a sleeping bag, from one of the few friends I had made on faculty, an instructor also, but in the deplorable subject of physical education. He and I had fenced occasionally, I'm seeing an important detail there, and had gone for infrequent walks. I sometimes wonder if he is curious about what happened to his camp gear or to Tarl Cabot. Surely the administration of the college was curious, and angry at the inconvenience of having to replace an instructor in the middle of the year, for Tarl Cabot was never heard of again on the campus of that college. My friend in the physical education department drove me a few miles to the mountains and dropped me off. We agreed to meet again in the 3 days at the same place. in 3 days at the same place. The first thing I did was check my compass, as if I knew what I was up to, and then proceeded to leave the highway well behind me. More quickly than I realized, I was alone and in the woods, climbing. Bristol, as you know, is a heavily urbanized area, and I was not well prepared for my first encounter with nature. Surely the college, though somewhat rural, was at least one of the outworks of, say, material civilization. I was not frightened, being confident that walking steadily in any given direction would be sure to bring me to one highway or another, or some stream or another, and that it would be impossible to become lost, or at least for long. Yeah, this is turning into the average British person's experience with understanding just how fucking huge the United States is. Anyway, primarily I was exhilarated, being alone with myself in the green pines and patches of snow. I trudged along for the better part of 2 hours before I finally yielded to the weight of the pack. I ate a cold lunch and was on my way again, getting deeper into the mountains. I was pleased that I had regularly taken a turn or two around the college track. Another important detail there. That evening, I dropped my pack near a rock platform and set about gathering some wood for a fire. I had gone a bit from my makeshift camp when I stopped, startled for a moment. Something in the darkness, to the left, lying on the ground, seemed to be glowing. It held a calm, hazy blue radiance. I put down the wood I had gathered and approached the object, more curious than anything else. It appeared to be a rectangular metal envelope, rather thin, not much larger than the normal envelope one customarily uses for correspondence. I touched it. It seemed to be hot. My hair rose on the back of my head. My eyes widened. I read, in a rather archaic English script inscribed in the envelope, 2 words. My name. Tarl Cabot. Okay, here we go. You know what? That's a drink. Yep. So our man is about to get whacked in the face with destiny. This ought to be fun. It was a joke. Somehow my friend had followed me. Must be hiding somewhere in the darkness. I called his name, laughing. There was no answer. I raced about the woods in a moment, shaking bushes, batting the snow from low-hanging branches of pines. I then walked more slowly, more carefully, being quiet. I would find him. It's a German, is a German light beer, Weihenstephaner Helles. Anyway, some 15 minutes passed. I was growing cold, angry. I shouted to him. I widened my search, keeping that strange metal envelope with its blue ambience the center of my movements. At last I realized he must have planted the odd object, left it for me to discover, and was probably on his way home by now, or was perhaps camping somewhere nearby. I was confident he was not within earshot, or he would have eventually responded. It was no longer funny. Not if he was near. Okay, there's a hyphen and it suddenly cuts off there. I returned to the object and picked it up. It seemed to be cooler now, though I still had the distinct impression of warmth. It was a strange object. I brought it back to my camp and built my fire against the darkness and cold. I was shivering in spite of the heavy clothing. I was sweating. My heart was beating. My breath was short. I was frightened. Accordingly, slowly and calmly, man loves his adjectives, I set about tending the fire, opened a can of chili, and set up sticks to hold the tiny cooking pot over the fire. These domestic activities slowed my pulse and succeeded in convincing me that I could be patient and was not even too much interested in the contents of the metal envelope. When the chili was heating, and not before, I turned my attention to the puzzling object. I turned it over and over in my hands and studied it by the light of the campfire. It was about 12 inches long and 4 inches high. It weighed, I guessed, about 4 ounces. The color of the metal was blue, and something of its ambience continued to characterize it. You know, I'm starting to see where Jim Thies got the idea for the Eye of Argon to go into these long descriptions about fairly trivial things here. Because we're getting a paragraph of detail about this fucking thing. Like, just its physical properties here. Anyway, right. The color of the metal was blue. Something of its ambience continued to characterize it, but the glow was fading. Also, the envelope was no longer seemed warm to the touch. How long had it lain waiting for me in the woods? How long ago had it been placed there? While I considered this, the glow faded abruptly. If it had faded earlier, I never would have discovered it in the woods. It was almost as if the glow had been connected with the intent of the sender, as if the glow, no longer needed, had been allowed to fade. The message has been delivered, I said to myself, feeling a bit silly as I said it. I did not find my private joke very funny. I looked closely at the lettering. It resembled some now outdated English script, but I knew too little about such things to hazard much of a guess at the date. Something about the lettering reminded me of that on a colonial charter, a page of which had been photocopied for an illustration in one of my books. 17th century, perhaps? The lettering itself seemed to be inset in the envelope, bonded in the metallic structure. I could find no seam or flap in the envelope. I tried to crease the envelope with my thumbnail, but failed. Feeling rather foolish, I took out the can opener I'd used on the chili can and attempted to force the metal point through the envelope. Light as the envelope seemed to be, it resisted the point as if I were trying to open an anvil. I leaned on the can opener with both arms, pressing down with all my weight. The point of the can opener bent into a right angle, but the envelope had not. Been okay, the writing here, the envelope had not, been scratched. Beautiful. I had the envelope carefully. I handled the envelope carefully, puzzled, trying to determine if it might be open. There was a small circle on the back of the envelope, and in the circle it seemed to be the print of a thumb. I wiped it on my sleeve, but it did not disappear. The other prints on the envelope, from my fingers, wiped away immediately. As well as I could, I scrutinized the print in the circle. It, too, like the lettering, seemed a part of the metal, yet its ridges and lineaments were exceedingly delicate. I don't know if this is the copy I grabbed having these issues, but there are some like basic formatting things here that I'm surprised Pat made it through an editorial pass. Anyway, at last I was confident that it was part of the envelope. Excuse me. At last I was confident that it was part of the envelope. He's talking about the circle with the thumbprint on it. I pressed it with my finger. Nothing happened. Tired of this strange business, I set the envelope aside and turned my attention to the chili, which was now bubbling over the small campfire. After I had eaten, I removed my boots and coat and crawled into the sleeping bag. I lay there beside the dying fire, looking up at the branch-lined sky and the mineral glory of the unconscious universe. I lay awake for a long time, feeling alone yet not alone, as one sometimes does in the wilderness, feeling as if one were the only living object on the planet, and as if the closest things to one's fate and destiny perhaps, lay outside our small world, somewhere in that small, remote alien pastures of the stars. He's dreaming of the skies. You know what? That's a drink. So our man has aspirations that he knows are up in the stars somewhere. He fences, he exercises, he's a published author, and destiny is about to catch him napping, perhaps literally. Anyway, a thought struck me with sudden swiftness, and I was afraid, but I knew what I must do. The matter of the envelope was not a hoax, not a trick. Somewhere, deep in whatever I am, I knew that I knew that and had known it from the beginning. Almost as if dreaming, yet with vivid clarity, I inched partly out of my sleeping bag. I rolled over and threw some wood on the fire and reached for the envelope. Sitting in the sleeping bag, I waited for the fire to rise a bit. Then I carefully placed my right thumb on the impression in the envelope, pressing down firmly. It answered to my touch, as I had expected it to, as I had feared it would. Excuse me. Perhaps only one man could open that envelope. He whose print fitted the strange lock. He whose name was Tarl Cabot. The apparent seamless envelope crackled open, almost with the sound of cellophane. An object fell from the envelope, a ring of red metal bearing the simple crest C. I barely noticed it in my excitement. There was lettering on the inside for the envelope, which had opened in a manner surprisingly like a foreign airmail letter, where the envelope serves also as stationery. The lettering was in the same script as my name on the outside of the envelope. I noticed the date and froze. My hands clenched on the metallic paper. It was dated the 3rd of February, 1640. It was dated more than 300 years ago, and I was reading it in the 6th decade of the 20th century. Oddly enough, also the day on which I was reading it was the 3rd of February. The signature at the bottom was not in the old script, but might have been done in the modern cursive English. I had seen the signature once or twice before, on some letters my aunt had saved. I knew the signature, though I could not remember the man. It was the signature of my father, Matthew Cabot, who had disappeared when I was an infant. I was dizzy, unsettled. It seems my vision reeled. I couldn't move. Things grew black for a moment, but I shook myself and clenched my teeth, breathed in the sharp, cold mountain air once, twice, 3 times, slowly gathering the piercing contact of reality into my lungs, reassuring myself that I was alive, not dreaming, that I held in my hands a letter with an incredible date delivered more than 300 years later in the mountains of New Hampshire, written by a man who presumably, if still alive, was, as we reckon time, no more than 50 years of age. My father. Even now I can remember the letter to the last word. I think it will carry its simple, abrupt message burned into the cells of my brain until, as it is elsewhere said, I have returned to the cities of dust. The 3rd day of February, in the year of our Lord, 1640. Tarl Cabot, son. Forgive me, but I have little choice in these matters. It has been decided. Do whatever you think is in your own best interest, but the fate is upon you, and you will not escape. I wish health to you and your mother. Carry on your person this ring of red metal, and bring me, if you would, a handful of our green earth. Discard this letter, it will be destroyed. With affection, Matthew Cabot. I read and reread the letter, and had become unnaturally calm. It seemed clear to me that I was not insane, or if I was, that insanity was a state of mental clarity, period, and comprehension quite apart from the torment I had conceived it to be. I placed the letter in my knapsack. What I must do was fairly obvious. Make my way out of the mountains as soon as it was... Okay, make my way out of the mountains as soon as it was fight. We just have a typo there. Perfect. That's a drink. Mm. Oh, no, there we go. Anyway, no, that might be too late. It would be mad, scrambling about in the darkness, but there seemed to be nothing else that would serve. I did not know how much time I had, but even if it was only a few hours, I might be able to reach some highway or stream, or perhaps a cabin. I checked my compass to get the bearing back to the highway. I looked uneasily about in the darkness. An owl hooted once, perhaps 100 yards to the right. Something out there might be watching me. It was an unpleasant feeling. I pulled on my boots and coat, rolled my sleeping bag, and fixed the pack. I kicked the fire to pieces, stamping out the embers, scuffing dirt over the sparks. Just as the fire was sputtering out, I noticed a glint in the ashes. Bending down, I retrieved the ring. It was warm from the ashes, hard, substantial, a piece of reality. It was there. I dropped it into the pocket of my coat and started off on my compass bearing, trying to make it back to the highway. I felt stupid trying to hike in the dark. I was asking for a broken leg or ankle, if not a neck. Still, if I could put a mile or so between myself and the old camp, that should be sufficient to give myself the margin of safety I needed. From what, I didn't know. I might then wait until morning and start off in the light, secure, confident. Moreover, it would be a simple matter to cover one's tracks in the light. I feel like it would be harder to cover your tracks in... I feel like it would be harder to cover your tracks in the day. I mean, you might be able to see them, but I don't know. I don't know camping. Anyway, the important thing was not to be at the old camp. I had made my way perilously through the darkness for perhaps 20 minutes when, to my horror, my knapsack and bedroll seemed to burst into blue flame on my back. It was an instant's action to hurl them from me, and I gazed, bewildered, awe-stricken, at what seemed to be a furious blue combustion that lit the pines on all sides as if with acetylene flames. It was like staring into a furnace. I knew that it was the envelope that had burst into flame, taking with it my knapsack and bedroll. I shuddered, thinking of what might have happened if I had been carrying it in the pocket of my coat. Yeah, way to go, buddy. Strangely enough, now that I think of it, I didn't run headlong from the spot, though I can't see why, and the thought did cross my mind that the bright, flare-like luminescence would reveal my position, if it was interest to anyone or anything. With the small flashlight, I knelt beside the flakes of my knapsack and bedroll. The stones on which they had fallen were blackened. There was no trace of the envelope. It seemed to have been totally consumed. There was an unpleasant, acrid odor in the air, some fumes of a sort that I was not familiar with. The thought came to me that the ring, which I had dropped in my pocket, might similarly burst into flame, but unaccountably, perhaps, I doubted it. There might be a point in someone's destroying the letter, but presumably there would be little point or no point in destroying the ring. Why should it have been sent if not to have been kept? Again, we are having a lot of ruminations on incidental or unimportant details. This is really giving me some Eye of Argon vibes here. Just, marginally better put together. Anyway, besides, I had been warned about the letter, a warning I had foolishly neglected, but had been asked to carry the ring. Whatever it was, father or no, that was the source of these frightening events. It did not seem to wish me harm. But then, I thought, somewhat bitterly, floods and earthquakes presumably wish no one harm either. Who knew the nature of the things or forces that were afoot that night in the mountains? Things and forces that might perhaps smash me, casually, as one innocently steps on an insect without being aware of it or caring. I still had the compass, and that constituted a firm link to reality. The silent but intense explosion of the envelope into flames had caused me momentarily to become confused, and that sudden return to the darkness from the hideous glaring light of the disintegrating envelope. My compass would get me out. With my flashlight, I examined it. As the thin, sharp beam struck the face of the compass, my heart stopped. The needle was spinning crazily, and oscillating backward and forward, as if the laws of nature had suddenly abridged in its vicinity. Aha! For the first time since I had opened the envelope, I began to lose my control. The compass had been my anchor and trust. I'd counted on it. Now it had gone crazy. There was a loud noise, but I now think it must have been the sound of my own voice, a sudden frightened shriek for which I will always bear the shame. Oh, man. Oh, our hero is off to a running start, ladies and gentlemen. The next thing, I was running like a demented animal in any direction, every direction. How long I ran, I don't know. It may have been hours, perhaps only a few minutes. I slipped and fell dozens of times and ran into the prickly branches of pines, the needles stabbing at my face. I may have been sobbing. I remember the taste of salt in my mouth. But mostly I remember a blind, headlong flight. A panic-stricken, unworthy, sickening flight. Once I saw two eyes in the darkness and screamed and ran from them, hearing the flap of wings behind me and the startled cry of an owl. Once I startled a small band of deer and found myself in the midst of their bounding shapes buffeting me in the darkness. The moon came out, and the mountainside was suddenly lit with its cold beauty, while on the snow and the trees, white on the snow and the trees and on the side of the slope, sparkling on the rocks. I could run no further. I fell to the ground, gasping for breath, suddenly asking myself why I had run. For the first time in my life, I had felt full. I had felt full, unreasoning fear, and it had gripped me like the paws of some grotesque predatory animal. I had surrendered to it for just a moment, and it had become a force that had carried me, hurling me about as if I were a swimmer captured in surging waves, a force that could not be resisted. It had departed now. I must never surrender to it again. I looked around and recognized the platform of rock near which I had set my bedroll. I saw the ashes of my fire. I had returned to my camp. Somehow I'd known that I would. Why you running? Why you running? Quite. As I lay there in the moonlight, I felt the earth beneath me, against my aching muscles, and the body that was covered with the foul-smelling sheen of fear and sweat. I felt then that it was good even to feel pain. Feeling was the important thing. I was alive. I saw the ship descend. For a moment it looked like a falling star, but then it suddenly became clear and substantial, like a broad, thick disk of silver. It was silent and settled on the rock platform, scarcely disturbing the light snow that was scattered on it. There was a slight wind in the pine needles, and I rose to my feet. As I did so, a door in the side of the ship slid quietly upward. I must go in. My father's words recurred in my memory. The fate is upon you. Before entering the ship, I stopped at the side of the large, flat rock on which it rested. I bent down and scooped up, as my father had asked, a handful of our green earth. I, too, felt that it was important to take something with me, something which, in a way, was my native soil. The soil of my planet, my world. So that was a whole chapter, just some bloke just going out in the woods and getting getting the MacGuffin and a note saying that space aliens are coming to pick you up. This is not a fast-moving story, it must be said. Do another drink here. Chapter 2: The Counter-Earth. I remembered nothing, from the time I'd boarded the silver disk in the mountains of New Hampshire until now. I awoke, feeling rested, and opened my eyes, half expecting to see my room in the alumni house at the college. I turned my head, without pain or discomfort. I seemed to be lying on some hard, flat object, perhaps a table in a circular room with a low ceiling some 7 feet high. There were 5 narrow windows, not large enough to let a man through. They rather reminded me of ports for bowmen in a castle tower. "Hey, guys, good to see you." They rather reminded me of ports for bowmen in a castle tower, yet they admitted sufficient light to allow me to recognize my surroundings. My first thought was that this must be Earth, and the sun's apparent size an illusion. Obviously, I was breathing, and that meant necessarily an atmosphere containing a large percentage of oxygen. It must be the Earth. But as I stood at the window, I knew that this could not be my mother planet. The building in which I now found myself was apparently one of an indefinite number of towers, like endless flat cylinders of varying sizes and colors, joined by narrow, colorful bridges that arched lightly between them. I could not lean far enough outside the window to see the ground. In the distance I could see hills covered with some type of green vegetation, but I could not determine whether or not it was grass. Wondering at my predicament, I turned back to the table. I strode over to it and nearly bruised my thigh on the stone structure. I felt for a moment as though I must have stumbled, have been dizzy. I walked around the room. I leaped to the top of the table, almost as I would have climbed a stair in the alumni house. It was different, a different movement. Less gravity. It had to be. The planet, then, was smaller than our Earth. and given the apparent size of the sun, perhaps somewhere closer to it. Ah, of course. Our man's got a degree in astrophysics as well. Why not? My clothes had been changed. My hunting boots were gone. My fur cap and the heavy coat and the rest of it. I was clad in some sort of tunic of a reddish color, which was tied at the waist with a yellow cord. It occurred to me that I was clean, in spite of my adventures, my panic-stricken route in the mountains. I had been washed. I saw that ring of red metal, with a crest of C, had been placed on the second finger of my right hand. I was hungry. I tried to put my thoughts together, sitting on the table, but there was too much. I felt like a child, knowing nothing, taken to some complex factory or store, unable to sort out his impressions, unable to comprehend this new and strange things that flash incessantly upon him. There was a tapestry to the right, a well-woven depiction of some hunting scene. I took it, but fancifully done. The spear-carrying hunters mounted on sorry. A well-woven depiction of some hunting scene, I took it, but fancifully done. The spear-carrying hunters mounted on birds of a sort, and attacking an ugly animal that reminded me of a boar, except it appeared to be too large, out of proportion to the hunters. Its jaws carried 4 tusks, curved like scimitars. It reminded me, with the vegetation in background and the classic serenity of the faces, of a Renaissance tapestry I had once seen on a vacation tour I had taken to Florence in my second year at the university. Opposite the tapestry, for decoration I assumed, hung a round shield with crossed spears behind it. The shield was rather like the old Greek shields on some of the red-figured vases in the London Museum. The design on the shield was unintelligible to me. I could not be sure if it was supposed to mean anything. It might have been an alphabetic monogram, or perhaps a mere delight to the artist. Above the shield was suspended a helmet, again reminiscent of a Greek helmet, perhaps of the Homeric period. It had a somewhat Y-shaped slot for the eyes, nose, and mouth in nearly solid metal. There was a savage dignity about it, with the shield and spears, all of them stable on the wall, as if ready, like the famous colonial rifle over the fireplace, for instant use. They were all polished and gleamed dully in the half-light. Aside from these things and 2 stone blocks, perhaps chairs, and a mat on one side, the room was bare. The walls and ceiling and floor were smooth as marble, and classic white. I could see no door in the room. I rose from the stone table, which was indeed what it was, and went to the window. I looked out and saw the sun. Our sun, it had to be. Okay, so there's a lack of punctuation here. I saw the sun, our sun, it had to be. No commas or anything to break the flow there. It seemed perhaps a fraction larger, but was difficult to be sure. I was confident that it was our own brilliant yellow star. The sky, like that of Earth, was blue. All good, Ivory. Hopefully it went well. Let's see. A panel on the wall slid sideways, and a tall, red-haired man, somewhere in his late 40s, dressed much as I was, stepped through. I hadn't known. I hadn't known, period, what to expect, what these people would be like. The man was an Earthman, apparently. He smiled at me and came forward, placing his hands on my shoulders and looking into my eyes. He said, I thought rather proudly, "You are my son, Tarl Cabot." "I am Tarl Cabot," I said. "I am your father." Yep, here we go. Oh boy. We are in for an info dump here, folks. "I am your father," he said, and shook me powerfully by the shoulders. We shook hands, on my part rather stiffly, yet this gesture of our common homeland somehow reassured me. I was surprised to find myself accepting this stranger not only as a being of my world, but as the father I couldn't remember. "Your mother?" he asked, his eyes concerned. "Dead, years ago," I said. He looked at me. "She, of all them, I loved most," he said, turning away, crossing the room. Okay, the Gore books do not have an editor and are well known for bad grammar, formatting, and very repetitive dialogue and narration. Oh yeah, yeah. We have definitely been picking up on that. I was just saying this totally reminds me of the Eye of Argon. Anyway, he appeared to be affected keenly, shaken. I wanted to feel no sympathy with him, yet I found that I could not help it. I was angry with myself. He had deserted my mother and me, had he not? And what was it now that he felt some regret? And how was it that he had spoken so innocently of all of them, whoever they might be? I did not want to find out. Yet somehow, in spite of these things, I found that I wanted to cross the room, to put my hand on his arm, to touch him. I felt somehow a kinship with him, with this stranger in his sorrow. My eyes were moist. Something stirred in me, obscure, painful memories that had been silent, quiet for many years. The memory of a woman I had barely known. of a gentle face, of arms that had protected a child who had awakened frightened in the night, and I remembered suddenly another face behind hers. "Father," I said. He straightened and turned to face me across that simple, strange room. It was impossible to tell if he had wept. He looked at me with sadness in his eyes, and his rather stern features seemed for a moment to be tender. Looking into his eyes, I realized, with an incomprehensible suddenness, and a joy that still bewilders me, that someone existed who loved me. "My son," he said. Oh God, the repetition is just wearing me down. I do a whole lot of stating the obvious in this. We haven't even gotten to anything crazy about the setting. It's just he's woken up in a tower on this other world, presumably Gor now. And I suppose we're about to find out what this is all about. Anyway, we met in the center of the room and embraced. I wept, and he did too, without shame. I learned later on that I learned later that on this alien world, a strong man may feel and express emotions, and that the hypocrisy of constraint is not honored on this planet as it is on mine. Oh, here we fucking go. Oh. Yep. Strong men cry. Strong men also cry. Let's see. Intentional and ritualistic, and I have wondered why it's there. Yeah, I can imagine. I feel like at some point it just becomes brainwashing. Anyway, okay, yeah. The hypocrisy of constraint is not honored on this planet as it is on mine. At last we moved apart. My father regarded me evenly. "She will be the last," he said. "I had no right to let her love me." I was silent. He sensed my feeling and spoke brusquely. "Thank you for your gift, Tarl Cabot," he said. I looked puzzled. Strong men cry when they drop weights on their big toe. Oh yeah, that is a defensible reason for crying. That's honestly that's the least of what I expect a person to do in that case. Anyway, I looked puzzled. "The handful of earth," he said. "A handful of my native ground." I nodded, not wanting to speak, wanting him to tell me the thousand things I had to know, to dispel the mysteries that had torn me from my native world and brought me to this strange room, this planet, to him, my father. "You must be hungry," he said. "I want to know where I am and what I'm doing here," I said. "Of course," he said, "but you must eat." He smiled. "While you satisfy your hunger, I shall speak to you." He clapped his hands twice, and the panel slid back again. I was startled. Through the opening came a young girl, somewhat younger than myself, with blonde hair bound back. She wore a sleeveless garment of diagonal stripes, the brief skirt of which terminated some inches above her knees. She was barefoot, and as her eyes shyly met mine, I saw they were blue and deferential. My eyes suddenly noticed her one piece of jewelry. A light steel band she wore as a collar. As quickly as she had come, she departed. "You may have her this evening if you wish." What? Said my father, who had scarcely seemed to notice the girl. Oh, here we fucking go. Oh. Hi, Pat Cat. Yep, tonight is a get comfy and get ready to have your minds broken. Yeah, you may have her this evening if you wish," said my father, who had scarcely seemed to notice the girl. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I said no. At my father's insistence, I began to eat, reluctantly, never taking my eyes from him, hardly tasting the food, which was simple but excellent. The meat reminded me of venison. It was not the meat of an animal raised on domestic grains. It had been roasted over an open flame. So our man is a meat connoisseur, it seems. The bread was still hot from the oven. The fruit, grapes and peaches of some sort, was fresh and as cold as mountain snow. After the meal I tasted the drink, which might not inappropriately be described as an almost incandescent wine. Oh, that is a mouthful there. Flashbacks of gore-themed RP rooms and shutters. God. I still can't believe this whole thing spawned a subculture. I have to peel back the layers of madness on this. Anyway, right. After the meal, I tasted the drink, which might not inappropriately be described as an almost incandescent wine, bright, dry, and powerful. I learned later it was called Kalana. That is hyphenated, Kalana. While I ate, and afterward, my father spoke. "Gor," he said, "is the name of this world. In all the languages of this planet, the word means homestone." He paused, noting my lack of comprehension. "Homestone," he repeated. Oh no, stream going boom. Hang on a second. Okay, let's see. So we had a crash. Where was I? Right. Okay, so winding back a bit. While I ate, and afterward, my father spoke. Gor, he said, is the name of this world. In all the languages of this planet, the world means homestone. He paused, noting my lack of comprehension. Homestone, he repeated. Simply that. In peasant villages on this world, he continued, each but was originally built around a flat stone which was placed in the center of the circular dwelling. It was carved with the family sign and was called the homestone. It was, so to speak, a symbol of sovereignty or territory, and each peasant, in his own hut, was a sovereign. Later, said my father, homestones were used for villages, and later still for cities. The homestone of a village was always placed in the market, in a city, or on the top of the highest tower. The homestone came naturally in time to acquire a mystique, and something of the same hot, sweet emotions as our native peoples of Earth feel toward their flags became invested in it. Just, like, we're not explaining where we are, or like we're going deep into the complex lore of the title of this world before we've explained to this poor schmuck where he is and why he's here. Panic is when I see a notification in my ring, only to realize what it is, open it, then immediately run to Facebook to tell Chris not to open the video. Oh, man. Eek. Nasty. That is unpleasant. Anyway, how many times are we going to hear Homestone? Probably a lot. Anyway, right. Right. As our native peoples of Earth feel their flags. Oh, I didn't update that. My bad. Let's see. Flags invested. All right. My father had risen to his feet and begun to pace the room, and his eyes seemed strangely alive. In time, I would come to understand more of what he felt. Indeed, there's a saying on Gor, a saying whose origin is lost in the past of this strange planet, that one who speaks of homestones should stand, for matters of honor are here involved. One who speaks of homestones should stand, for matters of honor are here involved, and honor is respected in the barbaric codes of Gor. These stones, said my father, are various of different colors, shapes, and sizes, and many of them are intricately carved. Some of the largest cities have small, rather insignificant homestones, but of incredible antiquity, dating back to the time when the city was a village or only a mounted pride of warriors with no settled abode. My father paused at the native. My father paused at the narrow window, I don't know where native came from, in the circular room, and looked out onto the hills beyond and fell silent. At last he spoke again. Where a man sets his homestone, he claims by law that land for himself. Good land is protected only by the swords of the strongest owners in the vicinity. Oh, God. He's still on this fucking stone. Like, I was expecting the weird, regressive shit to happen more or less out the gate, but they're just hyper fixated on the smallest details here. It's kind of insane for a completely different reason. You know what? I'm going to up the threat level here. I have underestimated this thing by reputation, by its reputation. We are upping the threat level to reading John Carter of Mars on a drunken bet. There we go. Now then. Yes, said my father, as if there were nothing incredible in this admission. He smiled. You have much to learn of Gor. Yet there is a hierarchy of homestones, one might say, and two soldiers who would cut one another down for their steel blades with their steel blades for an acre of fertile ground will fight side by side to the death for the homestone of their village, or of the city within whose ambit their village lies. This is pretty much John Carter of Mars, but with humans. Yeah, I'm definitely getting that vibe. I warned you this was a hell of a trip. Oh, God. I don't think I was ready, but I must forge on. I shall show you some day, he said, of my own small homestone, which I keep in my chambers. It encloses a handful of soil from the earth, a handful of soil that I first brought with me when I came to this world. To this hyphen world hyphen a long time ago. He looked at me evenly. I shall keep the handful of earth you brought, he said, his voice very quiet, and some day it may be yours. His eyes seemed moist. He added, if you should live to earn a homestone. I rose to my feet and looked at him. He turned away, as if lost in thought. It is the occasional dream of a conqueror or a statesman, he said, to have but a single supreme homestone for the planet. Then after a long moment, not looking at me, he said, it is rumored there is such a stone, but it lies in the sacred place, and is the source of the priest king's power. Who are the priest kings? I asked. My father faced me, and he seemed troubled, as if he might have said more than he intended. Introduce Carl to the houseplants of Gor. Oh boy. That sounds like a trip. Anyway, my father faced me, and he seemed troubled, as if he might have said more than he intended. Neither of us spoke for perhaps a minute. Yes, said my father at last. I must speak to you of priest-kings. He smiled. But let me begin in my own way, that you may better understand the nature of that whereof I speak. We both sat down again, the stone table between us. My father calmly and methodically explained many things to us. As he as he spoke, my father often referred to the planet Gor as the Counter-Earth, taking the name from the writings of the Pythagoreans who first speculated on the existence of such a body. Oddly enough, one of the expressions in the tongue of Gor for our son was Lartorvis, which means the central fire, another Pythagorean expression, except that it had not been, as I understand it, originally used by the Pythagoreans to refer to the sun, but to another body. The more common expression for the sun was Tor to Gor, which means light upon the homestone. There was a sect. Oh god, the constant referring back to homestones. Like, we're getting into the goofy sci-fi of this, but it is the structure of the text that is just wearing me down. Have another count of the word homestone. Yeah, no kidding. I'll have to work that in somewhere. It's only one browser screen long. I'll just drop it in Discord. Alright, I'll check it out later. It sounds wild. Right. The more common expression for the sun was Tor to Gor, which means light upon the homestone. There was a sect among the people that worshipped the sun, I later learned, but it was insignificant both in numbers and power when compared with the worship of the priest-kings who, whatever they were accorded the honors of divinity. Theirs, it seems, was the honor of being enshrined as the most ancient gods of Gor, and in time of danger a prayer to the priest-kings might escape the lips of even the bravest men. The priest-kings, said my father, are immortal, or so most here believe. Do you believe it? I asked. I don't know, said my father. I think perhaps I do. What sort of men are they? I asked. Take a drink every time Homestone is mentioned. Challenge level impossible. Oh yeah. I'd be dead on the floor by now. What sort of men are they? I asked. It is not known that they are men, said my father. Then what are they? Perhaps gods. You're not serious. I am, he said. Is not a creature beyond death, of immense power and wisdom, worthy to be so spoken of. I was quiet. This would be ended violently. Oh yeah, I'd need another one by the end of the night. My speculation, however, said my father, is that the priest-kings are indeed men. Men much as we, or humanoid organisms of some type who possess a science and technology as far beyond our normal ken as that of our 20th century would be to the alchemists and astrologers of the medieval universities. His supposition seemed plausible to me, for from the very beginning I had understood that in something or someone existed a force and clarity of understanding beside which the customary habits of rationality as I knew them were little more than the tropisms of the unicellular animal. God, that was one sentence is a paragraph. I'm going to read that again, but I'm taking a drink over that. Oh, man. Okay, his supposition seemed plausible to me, for from the very beginning I had understood that in something or someone existed a force and clarity of understanding beside which the customary habits of rationality as I knew them were little more than the tropisms of the unicellular animal. Even the technology of the envelope with its patterned thumb lock, the disorientation of my compass, and the ship that had brought me, unconscious, to the strange world, argued for an incredible grasp of unusual, precise, and manipulable forces. There's another paragraph that is a single sentence. Jesus Christ. The priest-kings, said my father, maintained the sacred palace in the Sardar Mountains, of wild vastness into which no man penetrates. The sacred place, to the minds of most men here, is taboo, perilous. Surely none have returned from those mountains. My father's eyes seemed far away, as if focused on sights he might have preferred to forget. Idealists and rebels have been dashed to pieces on the frozen escarpments of those mountains. If one approaches the mountains, one must go on foot. Our beasts will not approach them. Parts of outlaws and fugitives who have sought refuge in them have been found on the plains below, like scraps of meat cast from an incredible distance to the beaks and teeth of wandering scavengers. My hand clenched on the metal goblet. The wine moved in the vessel. I saw my image in the wine, shattered by the tiny forces in the vessel. Then the wine was still. Sometimes, said my father, his eyes far away, when men are old or have had enough of life, they assault the mountains, looking for the secret of immortality in the barren crags. If they have found their immortality, none have confirmed it, for none have returned to the tower cities. He looked at me. Some think that such men in time become priest-kings themselves. My own speculation, which I judge as likely or unlikely to be true as the more popular superstitious stories, is that it is death to learn the secret of the priest-kings. You do not know that, I said. No, admitted my father, I do not know that. My father then explained to me something of the legends of the Priest Kings. Okay, now Priest Kings is one word. Previously it was hyphenated, now it's one word, and he does it again in the next line too. This is incredible. And I gathered that they seemed to be true to this degree, at least that the Priest Kings could destroy or control whatever they wished, that they were, in effect, the divinities of this world. It was supposed that they were aware of all that had transpired on their planet, but if so, I was informed that they seemed, on the whole, to take little note of it. It was rumored, according to my father, that they cultivated holiness in their mountains, and in their contemplation could not be concerned with the realities and evils of the outside and unimportant world. They were, so to speak, absentee divinities, existent but remote, not to be bothered with the fears and turmoil of the mortals beyond their mountains. This conjecture, the seeking of holiness, however, seemed to me to not fit not well with the sickening fate apparently awaiting those who attempted the mountains. I found it difficult to conceive of one of those theoretical saints rousing himself from contemplation to hurl the scraps of interlopers to the plains below. There's at least one area, however, said my father, in which the priest-kings do take a most active interest in this world, and that is the area of technology. They limit, selectively, the technology available to us, the men below the mountains. For example, incredibly enough, weapon technology is controlled to the point where the most powerful devices of war are the crossbow and lance. Furthermore, there is no mechanized transportation or communication equivalent, or detection devices such as the radar and sonar equipment so much in evidence in the military establishments of your world. On the other hand, he said, you will learn that in lighting, shelter, agricultural techniques, and medicine, for example, the mortals, or the men below the mountains, are relatively advanced. He looked at me, amused, I think. You wonder, he said, why the numerous, rather obvious deficits in our technology have not been repaired, in spite of the priest-kings. It crosses your mind that there must exist minds in this world capable of designing such things as, say, rifles and armored vehicles. Surely these things must be produced, I urged. And you are right, he said grimly. From time to time they are, but their owners are then destroyed, bursting into flame. Like the envelope of blue metal? Yes, he said. It is flame death, capitalized, merely to possess a weapon of the interdicted sort. Sometimes bold materials create or acquire such war materials, and sometimes for as long as a year has escaped the flame death, but sooner or later they are struck down. His eyes were hard. I once saw it happen, he said. Clearly, he did not wish to discuss the topic further. What of the ship that brought me here? I asked. Surely that is a marvelous example of your technology. Not of our technology, but of that of the priest kings, he said. I do not believe that ship was manned by any of the the men below the mountains. By priest kings? I asked. Frankly, said my father, I believe the ship was remotely controlled from the Sardar Mountains, as are said to be all the voyages of acquisition. Of acquisition? Yes, said my father, and long ago I made the same strange journey, as have others. But for what end? To what purpose? I demanded. Each perhaps for a different end, for each perhaps a different purpose, he said. My father then spoke to me of the world on which I found myself. He said, from what he could learn from the initiates, who claimed to serve as the intermediaries of priest-kings to men, that the planet Gor had originally been a satellite of a distant sun, in one of the fantastically remote blue galaxies. It was moved by the science of the priest-king several times in its history, seeking again and again a new star. Oh, drink time, don't mind if I do. Thanks, Becco. I needed that. Good to have you here. Settle in. We're just now learning the deep lore behind Gor. So Gor was moved by the science of the Priest King several times in its history, seeking again and again a new star. I regarded the story as improbable, at least in part, for several reasons, primarily having to do with the sheer spatial improbabilities of such a migration, which, even at a speed approximating light, would have taken billions of years. Moreover, in moving through space, without a sun for photosynthesis and warmth, all life would surely have been destroyed. If the planet had been moved at all, and I knew enough to understand that this was empirically possible, it must have been brought into our system from a closer star. Perhaps it had once been a satellite of Alpha Centauri, but even so, the distances still seemed almost unimaginable. Yeah, our man clearly dabbled in astrophysics in his time at not specified New England University. Definitely not Princeton. Anyway, theoretically, I did admit that the planet might have been moved without destroying its life, but the engineering magnitude of such a feat staggered the imagination. Perhaps life might have been suspended temporarily, or hidden beneath the planet's surface with sufficient sustenance and oxygen for the incredible journey. In effect, the planet would have functioned as a gigantic sealed spacecraft. Aw. Hi, Celine. Good to have you here. Definitely a good time to settle in and get comfy. Anyway, right. So perhaps life might have been suspended temporarily hidden. In fact, the planet would have functioned as a gigantic sealed spacecraft. There was another possibility I mentioned to my father. Perhaps the planet had been in our system all the time, but had been undiscovered, unlikely though that might be, given the thousands of years of study of the skies by men, from the shambling creatures of the Neander Valley to the brilliant intellects of Mount Wilson and Palomar. To my surprise, this absurd hypothesis was welcomed by my father. That, he said with animation, is the theory of the sun shield, he added. That is why I like to think of this planet as the counter-Earth. Not only because of its resemblance to our native world, but because, as a matter of fact, it is placed at a counterpoise to the Earth. It has the same plane of orbit and maintains its orbit in such a way as always to keep the central fire. Uh-oh, what's this? Disconnected, reconnecting. Oh, did we disconnect? I just gotta notice OBS. I was having trouble. Hang on a second. Excellent, excellent. All right, back to it. So yeah, that's why I like to think of our planet as the counter-Earth, not only because of its resemblance to our native world, but because, as a matter of fact, it is placed as a counterpoise to the Earth. It has the same plane of orbit and maintains its orbit in such a way as always to keep the central fire between it and its planetary sister, our Earth. Dubstep Diablo 4 ad. Oh, God. We should be back, yes. We are so fucking back, in fact. Anyway. In its planetary sister, our Earth, even though this necessitates occasional adjustments in its speed of revolution. But surely, I protested, its existence could be discovered. One can't hide a planet the size of the Earth in our own solar system. It's impossible. You underestimate the priest kings and their science, said my father, smiling. Any power that is capable of moving a planet, and I believe the priest kings possess this power, is capable of effecting adjustments in the motion of the planet, such adjustments as might allow it to use the sun indefinitely as a concealing shield. One cannot hide a planet the size of a planet. Oh, God. Yeah, I need a drink for this. Like, I have a rudimentary understanding at best of planet-scale physics, but I'm pretty sure this would cause problems that are not discussed here. Yes. Let's see. The orbits of the other planets would be affected, I pointed out. Gravitational perturbations, said my father, can be neutralized. His eyes shone. If you cringely laugh. Oh, that's a double drink. I get the feeling that won't be long now. It is my belief, he said, that the priest kings can control the forces of gravity, at least in localized areas, and indeed that they do so. In all probability, their control over the motion of the planet is somehow connected with its capacity. Consider certain consequences of this power. Physical evidence, such as light or radio waves, which might reveal the presence of the planet, can be prevented from doing so. The priest kings might gravitationally warp the space in their vicinity, causing light or radio waves. Oh, time for another drink. All right. There we go. Okay, causing light or radio waves to be diffused, curved, or deflected in some way as to not to expose their world. I must have appeared unconvinced. Exploratory satellites can similarly be dealt with, added my father. He paused. Of course, I only propose hypotheses, for what the priest kings do and how it is done is known only to them. So yeah, we just spent like an entire page talking about the theoretical physics of concealing this place, and ends with we have no idea. You could have just led with that one, mate. Anyway, I drained the last sip of the heady wine in the metal goblet. Actually, said my father, there is evidence of the existence of the counter-Earth. I looked to him. Yeah, the conclusion is literally done. Oh, lol. Yeah. Certain natural signals in the radio band of the spectrum, said my father. My astonishment must have been obvious. Yes, he said, but the hypothesis of another world is regarded as so incredible, this evidence has been interpreted to accord with other theories. Sometimes even imperfections in instrumentation have been supposed rather than admit the presence of another world within our solar system. So yeah, this is just why SETI hasn't found out about this. But why would this evidence not be understood, I asked. Surely you know, he laughed, one must distinguish between the data to be interpreted and the interpretation of the data, and one chooses, normally, the interpretation that preserves as much as possible of the old world view. And in the thinking of the Earth, there is no place for Gor, its true sister planet, the Counter-Earth. God almighty, this is going some places. My father had finished speaking. He rose and gripped me by the shoulders, held me for a moment, and smiled. Then silently the door in the wall slid aside, and he strode from the room. He had not spoken to me of my role or destiny, whatever it was to be. He did not wish to discuss the reason for which I had been brought to the Counter-Earth, nor did he explain to me the comparatively minor mysteries of the envelope and its strange letter. Most keenly, perhaps, I had missed that he had not spoken to me of himself, for I wanted to know him. Okay, comma, semicolon. I wanted to know him, comma, semicolon. That kindly remote stranger whose bones were in my whose bones were in my body, whose blood flowed in mine, my father. That is an expression right there. Mm. Yeah, this is extraordinary dedication to making this hand wave as long as possible. Thought I'd be drinking due to cringe sex stuff. He was bamboozled drinking due to cringe nerd stuff. Yeah. Like, I was braced for the uncomfortable sex stuff. This is hitting on a level I was unprepared for. I got rope-a-doped. Anyway, I now inform you that I write of my own experience I know to be true, and that what I have accepted on authority I believe to be true, but I shall not be offended if you disbelieve, for I, too, in your place, would refuse to believe. Indeed, on the small evidence I can present in this narrative, you are obliged, in all honesty, to reject my testimony, or at the very least to suspend judgment. Okay, he said this like leaving to go hiking, to go camping was the last time anyone saw him, yet somehow he's addressing someone on Earth with this story. He hit you with the left when you were expecting the strong straight right. Trickery. Yeah, no kidding. Anyway, let's see. Indeed, on the small evidence I can present with this narrative, you are obliged, in all honesty, to reject my testimony, or at the very least to suspend judgment. In fact, there is so little probability that the tale will be believed that the priest kings of Sardar, the keepers of the sacred palace, have apparently granted that it may be recorded. Okay, so yeah, he's recording a message, and theoretically, it might someday get to someone on Earth. I'm glad of this, because I must tell of this story. I have seen things of which I must speak, even if, as it is said here, only to the towers. Why have the priest kings been so lenient in this case, those who control this second Earth? I think the answer is simple. Enough humanity remains in them, if they are human, for we have never seen them, to be vain. Enough vanity remains in them to wish to inform you of their existence, if only in a way that you will not accept or be able to consider seriously. Perhaps there is humor in the sacred place, or irony. After all, suppose you could accept this tale, should you learn of the Counter-Earth and of the voyages of acquisition. What could you do? You could do nothing. You, with your rudimentary technology of which you are so proud. You could do nothing for at least 1,000 years, and by that time, if the Priest Kings chose, the planet will have found a new sun, and new peoples to populate its verdant surface. And that's where the chapter ends. Awesome. It's like, yeah, I don't know why they're letting us record this. These are a bunch of reasons why, and there's nothing you can do about it anyway. Like, this is where we're going with this. God almighty. Chapter 3. The Tarn. Ho! Cried Torm, that most improbable member of the caste of scribes, throwing his blue robes over his head as though he could not bear to see the light of day. Out of the robes then popped the sandy-haired head of the scribe, his pale blue eyes twinkling on each side of that sharp needle of a nose. He looked me over. Yes, he cried, I deserve it. Back went the head into the robes. Muffled, his voice reached me. Why must I, an idiot, always be always afflicted with idiots? Out came the head. Have I nothing better to do? Have I not 1,000 scrolls gathering dust on my shelves, unread, unstudied? I don't know, I said. Look, he cried in actual despair, waving his blue-robed arms hopelessly at the messiest chamber I had seen on Gor. His desk, a vast wooden table, was piled with papers and pots of ink, and pens and scissors and leather fasteners and binders. There was no square foot of the chamber that did not contain racks of scrolls, and others, hundreds perhaps, were piled like cordwood here and there. His sleeping mat was unrolled, and his blankets must not have been aired for weeks. His personal belongings, which seemed to be negligible, were stuffed into the meanest of scroll racks. Okay, with that last chapter, we can end the book then. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't matter if we know anything about this story. We can't do anything about it anyway. Uh, One of the windows into Torm's chamber was quite irregular, and I noted that it had been forcibly enlarged. I imagined him with a carpenter's hammer, angrily cracking and banging away at the wall, chipping away the stone that more light might enter his room. And always under his table a brazier filled with hot coals burned near the feet of the scribe, perilously close to the scholarly litter with which the floor was strewn. Oh yeah, that's safe. It seemed that Torm was always cold, or at best never quite warm enough. The hottest days would be likely to find him wiping his nose on the sleeve of his blue robes, shivering miserably and lamenting the price of fuel. Torm was of slight build, and reminded me of an angry bird, which enjoys nothing so much as scolding squirrels. His blue robes were worn through in a dozen spots, only 2 or 3 of which had been ineptly attacked by thread. One of his sandals had a broken strap that had been carelessly knotted back together. The Gorians I had seen in the past few weeks had tended to be meticulous in their dress, taking great pride in their appearance, but Torm had apparently better things on which to spend his time. Among these things, unfortunately, was berating those like myself who were hapless enough to fall within the ambit of his wrath. Yet, in spite of his incomparable eccentricities, his petulance and exasperation, I felt drawn to the man, and sensed in him something I admired, a shrewd and kind spirit, a sense of humor, and a love of learning, which can be one of the deepest and most honest of loves. It was this love for his scrolls, and for the men who had written them, perhaps centuries before, that most impressed me about Torm. Time for another drink? Yep. Yeah, I know. This is impressive. Like I was again, I had expected content to be rubbish. I had not expected the literal text of the book to assault me in this way. Anyway, like it was this love for scrolls and for the men who had written them, perhaps centuries before, that most impressed me about Torm. In his way, he linked me, this moment, and himself with generations of men who had pondered on the world and its meaning. Incredible as it may seem, I did not doubt that he was the finest scholar in the City of Cylinders, as my father had said. With annoyance, Torm poked through one of the enormous piles of scrolls, and at last, on his hands and knees, fished out one skimpy scroll, set it in the reading device, a metal frame with rollers at the top and bottom, and, pushing a button, spun the scroll to its opening mark, a single sign. "Alka," said Torm, pointing one long, authoritative finger at the sign. "Alka," he said. "Alka," I repeated. We looked at one another, and both of us laughed. A tear of amusement formed along the side of his sharp nose, and his pale blue eyes twinkled. I had begun to learn the Gorian alphabet. In the next few weeks, I found myself immersed in intense activity, interspersed with carefully calculated rest and feeding periods. At first only Torm and my father were my teachers, but as I began to master the language of my new home, numerous others, apparently of Earth stock, assumed responsibility for my lessons in special areas. Torm's English, incidentally, was spoken with a Gorian accent. He had learned our tongue from my father. Most Gorians would have regarded it as a worthless tongue, since it is nowhere spoken on the planet, but Torm had mastered it, apparently only for the delight of seeing how living thought could express itself in yet another garb. Almost worth the lingering dulcet tones, the horrible words which is gore. Yeah, I hate it when your scrolls are not auto-rewinding. I know, right? Be kind, rewind, assholes. Anyway. Let's see. Most Gorians would have yet another garb. Here we go. The schedule that was forced upon me was meticulous and grueling, and except for rest and feeding, alternated between times of study and times of training, largely in arms, but partly in the use of various devices as common to the Gorians as adding machines and scales are to us. Okay, so yeah, we're learning to read. This dude is learning to read and sword fight at the same time. Perfect. One of the most interesting was the translator, which could be set for various languages. Whereas there was a main common tongue on Gor, with apparently several related dialects or sub-languages, some of the Gorian languages bore in sound little resemblance to anything I have heard before, at least as languages. They resembled rather the cries of birds and the growls of animals. There were sounds I knew could not have been produced by a human throat. Although the machines could be set for various languages, one term of the translation symmetry, at least in the machines I saw, was always Gorian. If I set the machine to, say, language A and spoke Gorian into it, it would, after a fraction of a second, emit a succession of noises, which is with the translation of my Gorian sentences into A. On the other hand, a new succession of noises into A would be received by a machine and emitted in the as a message in Gorian. Okay, so they invented a Chinese room. All right, that's a reasonable accomplishment. My father, to my delight, had taped one of these translation devices with English, and accordingly it was a most useful tool in working out equivalent phrases. Also, of course, he and Torm worked intensively with me. The machine, however, particularly to Torm's relief, allowed me to practice on my own. These translation machines are a marvel of miniaturization, each of them about the size of a portable typewriter, being programmed for 4 non-Gorian languages. The translations, of course, are rather literal. The vocabulary is limited to recognitions of only about 25,000 equivalencies for each language. What would happen if you put 2 of these devices across each other, set complementary languages, and said something? Yeah. I feel like there is some unexplored utility to these devices that we're going into a lot of detail about to show how that translating to languages that are not native to Gor is a regular occurrence on Gor. Which begs the question of how, like, why would Earth language. Like, presumably, if you're dealing with a captive populace that's been dropped into here. Like, this is. I'm getting the sense this is basically Space Australia. That these priest kings have been kidnapping people, dropping them on here, and over the course of eons or longer, the humans there have sort of bashed together their own language, cobbled together from whatever they had on Earth. I get that, but I don't know. I get the feeling I might be putting more thought into it than is here. Anyway, accordingly, for a subtle communication or the fullest expression of thought, the machine was inferior to a skilled linguist. The machine, however, according to my father, retained the advantage that its mistakes would not be intentional, and that its translations, even if inadequate, would be honest. You must learn, Torm had said, matter-of-factly, the history and lessons of Gor, its geography and economics, its social structures and customs, such as the caste system and clan groups, the right of placing the homestone, the places of sanctuary, when quarter is and is not permitted in war, and so on. I mean, other than the Aboriginal people living there, that is basically how it was treated. It's just a giant penal colony. And I don't get the sense these people were brought here randomly. Like, clearly our protagonist here has been brought here with some destiny in mind, but is that the case for everybody? Like, I have a lot of questions here that I feel like are not being that are not being discussed here, let's say. Like, obviously these people wouldn't necessarily know, but surely that must come up at some point. Anyway, and I learned these things, or as much as I could in the time I was given. Occasionally, Torm would cry out in horror as I made a mistake, incomprehension and disbelief written large on his features, and he would then sadly take up a large scroll containing the work of an author of whom he disapproved and strike me smartly on the head with it. One way or another, he was determined I should profit from his instruction. A giant penal colony filled with death wildlife. Yeah, getting that vibe here. Oddly enough, there was little religious instruction, other than to encourage awe of the priest kings, and what there was, Tor refused to administer, instead insisting that it was the province of the initiates. Religious matters on this world tend to be rather carefully guarded by the caste of the initiates, who allow members of other castes to little participation in their sacrifices and ceremonies. I was given some prayers to the priest kings. Okay, so we had priest kings with hyphens earlier, then we had priest kings as one word, and now we have priest kings as 2 words. You know what? That deserves a drink. Oh, man. My inner grammar Nazi is reeling. He cannot take this. He's melting like he just opened the Ark of the Covenant in front of him. Anyway, right. I was given some prayers to the priest kings to memorize, but they were in Old Gorian, a language cultivated by the initiates, but not spoken generally on the planet. Where are the king priests? Oh, man. Excellent question. Let's see. Let's see. Language cultivated by the initiates but not spoken generally on the planet. I never bothered to learn them. To my delight, I learned that Torm, whose memory was phenomenal, had forgotten them years ago. I sensed that a certain distrust existed between the caste of scribes and the caste of initiates. So we're getting some space bureaucracy here. Awesome. The ethical teachings of Gor, which are independent of the claims and propositions of the initiates, amount to little more than the caste codes, collections of sayings whose origins are lost in antiquity. I was specially drilled in the code of the warrior caste. It's just as well, said Torm. You would never make a scribe. The code of the warrior was, in general, characterized by a rudimentary chivalry, emphasizing loyalty to the pride chiefs and the home stone. It was harsh, but with a certain gallantry, a sense of honor I could respect. A man could do worse than live by such a code. I was also instructed in the double knowledge. The double knowledge. Oh. That is, I was instructed in what the people on the whole believed, and then I was instructed in what the intellectuals were expected to know. Yeah, think on that one, sheep. Those are words that make no sense. The knowledge. Sometimes there was a surprising discrepancy between the two. For example, the population as a whole, the castes below the high castes, were encouraged to believe their world was a broad, flat disk. Oh, awesome! We have space flat earthers on here, or flat counter earthers. Yes! Perhaps this was to discourage them from exploration, or to develop in them a habit of relying on common sense prejudices, something of a social control device. On the other hand, the high castes, specifically the warriors, builders, scribes, initiates, and the physicians, were told the truth in such matters, perhaps because it was thought they would eventually determine it for themselves. Yeah, flat gorers. You know what? That deserves a drink, too. Oh, man, this is going some places. Right. On the other hand, the high caste, specifically the warriors, builders, scribes, initiates, and physicians, were told the truth in such matters, perhaps because it was thought they would eventually determine it for themselves. From observations such as the shadow of their planet on one another of Gor's 3 small moons during eclipses, the phenomenon of sighting the tops of distant objects first, and the fact that certain stars could not be seen from certain geographical positions. If the planet had been flat, precisely the same set of stars would have been observable from every position on its surface. Yeah, so now we're going into these specific details of why we don't lie to these specific people about the flat Earth theory. Yeah, Gore is indeed a donut. Yeah, if this was like an Alderson disc or something, that would actually be kind of cool. But I love big, dumb space objects that are wildly impractical, and stories need more of them. Anyway, I wonder, however, if this second knowledge, that of the intellectuals, might not be as carefully tailored to preclude inquiry on the level as the first knowledge apparently was to preclude inquiry on the level of the lower caste. I would guess that there is a third knowledge that reserved to the priest kings. The city-state, said my father, speaking to me late one afternoon, is the basic political division on Gore hostile cities, controlling what territory... what the fuck? Okay, the city-state, said my father, speaking to me one late afternoon, is the basic political division on Gore hostile, one word, cities, controlling what territory they can in their environs, surrounded by a no-man's land of open ground on every side. How is leadership determined in these cities? I asked. Rulers, he said, are chosen from the high caste. Yeah, check if there's a Hollow Gore novel. Yeah, we need to find out if there's lizard people down there. Where's Mariana Blavatsky? She'll know about this. Anyway, high caste? Yes, of course, was his answer. In fact, in the first knowledge, there's a story told to the young in their public nurseries that if a man from lower caste should come to rule in a city, that city would come to ruin. I know. Oh, God. Like, this is hitting me in directions I wasn't expecting. And I'm just punch drunk now, and I'm flailing blindly against a blurry thing that I cannot see clearly. Anyway, right. In the first knowledge, there's a story told to the young in their public nurseries that if a man from the lower caste should come to rule in a city, the city would come to ruin. I must have appeared annoyed. The caste structure, said my father patiently, with perhaps the trace of a smile on his face, is relatively immobile but not frozen. It depends on more than birth. For example, if a child is in his schooling, shows that he can raise caste, as the expression is, he is permitted to do so. Time for another drink. All right. Okay, but similarly, if a child does not show the attitude expected of his caste, whether it be, say, that of a physician or warrior, he is lowered in caste. I see, I said, not much reassured. You know, I feel like double knowledge deserves an elevation of the threat level here. We are upping the threat level to Russia's moving pictures. This is very clearly going to work on levels I was not expecting. Anyway, the high caste in a given city, said my father, elect an ambassador and council for stated terms. In times of crisis, a war chief, or ubar, is named, who rules without check and by decree until, in his judgment, the crisis is past. In his judgment? I asked skeptically. Normally the office is surrendered after the passing of the crisis, said my father. It is part of the warrior's code. But what if he does not give up the office? I asked. I had learned enough of Gor by now to know that one could not always count on the caste codes being observed. Those who do not desire to surrender their power, said my father, are usually deserted by their men. The offending war chief is simply abandoned. So I had to think for the classics. Are usually deserted by their men. The offending war chief is simply abandoned, left alone in his palace to be impaled by the citizens of the city he has tried to usurp. I nodded, imagining a palace empty save for one man sitting alone on his throne, clad in his robes of state, waiting for the angry people outside the gates to break through and work their wrath. But, said my father, sometimes a war chief, or ubar, it's one of the two, wins the hearts of his men, and they refuse to withdraw their allegiance. What happens then? I asked. He becomes a tyrant, said my father. Okay, so yeah, now we're learning some, basic political theory here. And he becomes a tyrant, said my father, and rules until eventually, in one way or another, he is ruthlessly deposed. My father's eyes were hard, and seemed fixed in thought. It was not mere political theory that he spoke to me. I gathered that he knew of such a man. Until, he repeated slowly, he is ruthlessly deposed. The next morning, it was back to Torm and his interminable lessons. In large outline, Gor, as would be expected, was not a sphere, but a spheroid. It was somewhat heavier in its southern hemisphere, and was shaped somewhat like the Earth in a rounded, inverted top. The angle of its axis was somewhat sharper than the Earth's, but not enough to prevent its having a glorious periodicity of seasons. Moreover, like the Earth, it had two polar regions and an equatorial belt, interspersed with northern and southern temperate zones. Okay, I feel like the... Again, I am not an expert by any means. I will defer to those who are. But I feel like if there's a noticeable shift in the... I feel like if there's a notable imbalance in weight of a planet, that's going to affect the poles in some way. I don't think you'd have a perfect equatorial belt like we have here on the Earth. I feel like it would be imbalanced in some way. By all means, feel free to correct me on this, but I feel like what they're describing is impossible and basically just has to be hand-waved by more Priest-King stuff. Anyway, the angle of its axis was somewhat sharper than Earth's, but not enough to prevent its having a glorious periodicity of its seasons. Moreover, like the Earth, it had two polar regions and an equatorial belt, interspersed with northern and southern temperate zones. Much of the area of Gor, surprisingly enough, was blank on the map, but I was overwhelmed trying to commit as many of the rivers, seas, plains, and peninsulas to memory as I could. So now our man's a cartographer. Awesome. Economically, the base of the Gorian life was the free peasant, which was perhaps the lowest but undoubtedly the most fundamental caste, and the staple crop was a yellow grain called sa tarna, or life daughter. Interestingly, the word for meat is sa tasna, which means life mother. Okay, I'm having some unfortunate implications from these names here, but I'm not going to drink on that just yet. Didn't he say he was pretty mediocre in school? I know, he's picking this up. He's picking up an entirely different language. He's picking up the physical properties of an entirely different planet. He is... Again, I recall that he learned fencing in school, so okay, maybe he learns how to fight properly in swords. I don't know. Yeah, the difference in axis inclination is much worse. Yeah, I feel like that would throw off any attempt to simulate an Earth-like climate. Anyway, incidentally, when one speaks of food in general, one always speaks of satasna. This expression for the yellow grain seems to be a secondary expression, derivative. This would seem to indicate that a hunting economy underlay or was perhaps was prior to the agricultural economy. This would be the normal supposition in any case, but what intrigued me here, perhaps for no sufficient reason, was the was the complex nature of expressions involved. This suggested to me that perhaps a well-developed language or mode of conceptual thought existed prior to the primitive hunting groups that must have flourished long ago on the planet. People had come, or had been brought to Gor, possibly, with a fully developed language. I wondered at the possible antiquity of the voyages of acquisition I had heard my father speak of. I had been the object of one such voyage, he, apparently, of another. I had little time for speculation, however, as I was trying to bear up under an arduous schedule which seemed designed to force me to become a Gorian in a matter of weeks, or perhaps see me die in the attempt. But I enjoyed these weeks, as one is likely to when learning and developing oneself, though to what end I was still ignorant. I met many Gorians other than Torm in those weeks. Free Gorians, mostly the caste of scribes and the caste of warriors. The scribes, of course, are the scholars and clerks of Gor, and there are divisions and rankings within the group, from simple copiers to the savants of the city. I had seen few women, but knew that they, when free, important detail there, were promoted or demoted within the caste system according to the same standards and criteria as the men, although this varied, I was told, considerably from city to city. On the whole, I liked the people I met, and I was confident that they were largely of Earth stock, that their ancestors had been brought to the planet in voyages of acquisition. Apparently, having been brought to the planet, they had simply been released, much as animals might be released in a forest preserve, or fish stocked free in a river. The ancestors of some of them might have been Chaldeans, hey, Fate Go represent, or Celts, or Syrians, or Englishmen brought to this world over a period of centuries from different civilizations, but the children, of course, and their children eventually became simply Gorian. In the long ages on Gor, almost all traces of Earth origin had vanished. Occasionally, however, an English word in Gorian, like axe or ship, would delight me. If your goal is to build up a population, bringing in one man makes absolutely no sense. Apart from just issues on the economy of scale, population growth is dependent on the number of females, not males. Yeah. I forget the ratio. Isn't it something like 1 to 7 or something to have a population, to have actual population growth ratio of males to females? I don't know. I'm taking a drink there just for the fun of it. But I feel like the Priest Kings are just doing this for shits and giggles. And this society on Gor basically worked out as some kind of happy accident. Let's see. Where did I leave off? Let's see. Right. Occasionally, however, an English word in Gorian, like axe or ship, would delight me. Certain other expressions seem clearly to be of Greek or German origin. If I had been a skilled linguist, I undoubtedly would have discovered hundreds of parallels and affinities, grammatical and otherwise, between Gorian and various of the Earth languages. Earth origin, incidentally, was not part of the first knowledge, though it was of the second. Torm, I once asked, why is Earth origin not part of the first knowledge? Is it not self-evident? He asked. No, I said. Ah, he said, and he closed his eyes very slowly and kept them shut for about a minute, during which time he was apparently subjecting the matter to most intense scrutiny. You're right, he said at last, opening his eyes. It is not self-evident. Then what do we do? I asked. We continue our lessons, said Torm. The caste system is socially efficient, given its openness with respect to merit, but I regarded it as somehow ethically objectionable. It was still too rigid, in my opinion, particularly with respect to the selection of rulers from the high castes and with respect to the double knowledge. But far more deplorable than the caste system was the institution of slavery. Oh, here we fucking go. There were only 3 statuses conceivable to the Gorian mind outside of the caste system: slave, outlaw, and priest king. Also, any mention of Chaldea is weird because it's a very minor state from the Babylonian times. Yeah. It's an interesting little detail right there. It's kind of funny that they would bring enough people to preserve culture from there. Like, you need a group of people to preserve knowledge on that scale. Drink? All right. Like, any preservation of culture kind of needs a stable group of people with a shared identity. But anyway, right. A man who refused to practice his livelihood or strove to alter status without the consent of the Council of High Castes was by definition an outlaw and subject to impalement. The girl I had originally seen had been a slave, and what I had taken to be the jewelry at her throat had been a badge of servitude. Another such badge was a brand concealed by her clothing. The latter marked her as a slave, and the former identified her master. One might change one's collar, but not one's brand. I had not seen this girl since the first day. I wondered what had become of her, but I did not inquire. One of the first lessons I was taught on Gor was that concern for a slave was out of place. I decided to wait. I did learn, casually from a scribe, not Torm, that slaves were not permitted to impart instruction to a free man, since it would place him in their debt and nothing was owed to a slave. If it was in my power, I resolved to do what I could to abolish what seemed to me a degrading condition. I once talked to my father about the matter, and he merely said that there were many things on Gor worse than the lot of slavery, particularly that of a tower slave. Without warning, with blinding speed, the bronze-headed spear flew towards my breast, the heavy shaft blurred like a comet's trail behind it. I twisted, and the blade cut my tunic cleanly, creasing the skin with a line of blood as sharp as a razor. It sunk 8 inches into the heavy wooden beams behind me. Had it struck me with that force, it would have passed through my body. "He's fast enough," said the man who had cast the spear. "I shall accept him." Yeah, rings the white savior bell. Here we go. Okay, so all of a sudden, we went from conversations about slavery on there to suddenly he is being attacked in some kind of combat training or tests. There's no scene break or transition or anything. It's just straight from talking about being a tower slave to being attacked. Anyway, this was my introduction to my instructor in arms, whose name was also Tarl. Okay, I shall call him the older Tarl. Okay. Oh, that's a drink. Yeah, quick time event. He's playing Shenmue. Oh, man. Okay, I shall call him the older Tarl. He was a blond Viking giant of a man, a bearded fellow with a cheerful, craggy face and fierce blue eyes. Imagine the awkwardness of just killing someone you were trying to train. Yeah, no kidding. Like, yes, the Outworlder that the Priest Kings brought here for purposes unknown is dead. Do we have another one we can, like, get? Is this important? Do we, like, tell somebody? What do we do now? Anyway, bearded fellow with a cheerful, craggy face and fierce blue eyes, who strode about as though he owned the earth on which he stood. His whole body, his carriage, the holding of his head, bespoke the warrior. A man who knew his weapons, and on the simple word of Gor, knew that he could kill almost any man who might stand against him. That's my son over there, dead. Should have learned to dodge. Clearly a skill issue. If there was one outstanding impression I gathered of the older Tarl in that first terrifying meeting, it was that he was a proud man, not arrogant, but proud, and rightfully so. I would come to know this skilled, powerful, proud man well. Indeed, the largest part of my education was to be in arms, mostly training in the spear and sword. The spear seemed light to me because of the gravity, and I soon developed a dexterity in casting it with considerable force and accuracy. I could penetrate a shield at close distance, and managed to develop a skill sufficient to hurl it through a thrown hoop about the size of a dinner plate at 20 yards. Okay, so we've got our training montage here crammed into an entire paragraph. That is definitely a drink right there. If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. Alright, that's up the counter there. Right, let's see. Once I objected. "What if you are wounded in the right arm?" demanded the older Tarl. "What will you do then?" "Run," suggested Torm, who occasionally observed the practice sessions. "No!" cried the older Tarl. "You must stand and be slain like a warrior." Torm tucked a scroll, which he had been pretending to read, under his arm. He wiped his nose sagely on the sleeve of his blue robe. "Is that rational?" he asked. The older Tarl seized a spear, and Torm, lifting his robes, hastily departed the training area. In despair, with my left arm, I lifted another spear from the spear rack to try once more. Eventually, perhaps more to my surprise than that of the older Tarl, my performance became almost creditable. I had increased my margin of survival by some obscure percentage. My training had been in the short stabbing sword of the Gorians was as thorough as they could make it. I had belonged to a fencing club at Oxford. Yep, there's the a Chekhov's skill there, and had fenced for sport and pleasure at the college in New Hampshire, but this current business was serious. Once again, I was supposed to learn to wield the weapon equally well with either hand, but again, I could never manage to develop the skill to my genuine satisfaction. I acknowledged to myself that I was inevitably, stubbornly right-handed, for better or worse. During my training with the sword, the older Tarl cut me unpleasantly a number of times, shouting out, annoyingly enough, I thought, "You are dead!" At last, near the end of my training, I managed to break through his guard and, pulling my stroke, to drive my blade against his chest. I withdrew it bright with his blood. He flung down his sword with a crash on the stone tiles and clasped me to his bleeding chest, laughing. "I am dead!" he shouted in triumph. He slapped me on the shoulders, proud as a father who has taught his son chess and has been defeated for the first time. God almighty. You know what? That needs a drink. Yeah, lower gravity wouldn't actually make you stronger or throwing. Yeah, like you would have to completely rethink the way you navigate the environment. Tarl is a grown man. He knows how to navigate based on Earth's gravity, and dealing with something lower would be immensely confusing. They would probably need several weeks of just basic physical training to get him to an acceptable level of familiarity with lower gravity navigation. It is not simple. Like, we put astronauts through training on this. Yeah, imagining just people kangarooing about. Yeah. Anyway, that empties out the beer, so we are going to take a break here. It is exercise time. Let us do some planking. And back. Now then. Yeah, basically what I'm saying is, if low gravity made you stronger, astronauts in the ISS would have a lot of issues. We know it's not the case because the ISS is the government facility that exists to stop us from realizing we're living in a glass dome. Wake up, sheeple! Yeah, it's just what strikes me is this novel. They clearly want to have their standard like medieval slash Roman aesthetic of like old-timey melee combat and period appropriate dresses and such, but then they're going into these like absurd technical details that throw the entire premise out of whack. Like, there's so many things that would be affected just by the physical shape of the planet. Yeah, they are definitely pulling from John Carter here. I'm familiar enough with the franchise there to say that with some confidence. Anyway, right. I've also learned the use of the shield, primarily to meet the cast spear obliquely so that it would deflect harmlessly. Toward the end of my training, I always fought with shield and helmet. I would have supposed that armor, or chainmail perhaps, would have been a desirable addition to the accoutrements of the Gorian warrior, but it had been forbidden by the priest kings. Hey, Vegeta, good to see you. How's it going tonight? A possible hypothesis to explain this is that the Priest Kings may have wished war to be a biologically selective process in which the weaker and slower perish and fail, period, to reproduce themselves. Okay, war as natural selection is revealing. You know, that's worth a drink. Mm. Oh, boy. This might account for the relatively primitive weapons allowed to the men below the mountains. On Gor, it was not the case that a cavern-chested toothpick could close a switch and devastate an army. What? On Gor, it was not the case that a cavern-chested toothpick. Okay, so he's talking about a weak person could close a switch and devastate an army. Okay, so he's talking about using guns. That's what it is. All right. Oh God, you injured your leg at work. Oh man, sorry to hear it, man. Yeah, that is not fun at all. Rest up and recover. Lord knows you've earned it. Anyway, also the primitive weapons guarantee that what selection went on would proceed with sufficient slowness to establish its direction and alter it if necessary. As for the planet shape, it's true that technically the Earth is roughly pear-shaped, which is what he described here for Gor 2, then he failed to understand that on the scale of Earth this is only technically the case. Yeah, again, we're talking about someone with a passable understanding of what makes Earth Earth, and thinking that just making a few things different can still result in a very similar environment. Like, we won't get into the technical details, but yeah, this would basically, but not be anywhere close to an Earth-like environment. except, the priest kings. But anyway, besides the spear and sword, the crossbow and longbow were permitted, and these latter weapons perhaps tended to redistribute the probabilities of survival somewhat more broadly than the former. It may be, of course, that the priest kings controlled weapons as they did simply because they feared for their own safety. I doubted that they stood against one another, man to man, sword to sword, in their own holy mountains, putting their principles of selection to the test in their own cases. Incidentally, speaking of the crossbow and longbow, I did receive some instruction in them, but not much. The older Tarl, my redoubtable instructor in arms, did not care for them, regarding them as secondary weapons almost unworthy for the hand of a warrior. Muscle thing, or my leg didn't get the message. My brain is trying to walk from my cab, leg didn't move right. Oh, man. Yeah, that is rough. I'm sorry to hear that. Diameter is roughly around 12,700 kilometers across. Difference due to bulging is around 25 kilometers. Yeah, yeah. It's noticeable but not negligible. Basically, the Earth is not a perfect sphere, but the difference is negligible given the scale we're talking about. Anyway, I did not share his contempt, and occasionally during my rest periods I had sought to improve my proficiency with them. I gathered that my education was coming to an end. Perhaps it wasn't the lengthening of the rest periods. Perhaps it wasn't the repetition of materials I had already encountered. Perhaps it was something in the attitude of my instructors. I felt that I was near ready, but for what I had no idea. One pleasure of these final days was that I had begun to speak Gorian with the facility that comes from constant contact with and intensive study of a language. Okay, so you're talking about fluently. You could just say had begun to speak Gorian fluently. I had begun to dream in Gorian, and to understand easily the small talk of my teachers among themselves when they were speaking for one another and not for the ears of an outlander. I had begun to think in Gorian as well, and after a time I was conscious of a deliberate mental shift involved in thinking in English. After a few English sentences or a page or so in one of my father's books, I would be at home again in my native tongue, but the shift was there, and necessary. I was fluent in Gorian. Once, when struck by the older Tarl, I had cursed in Gorian, and he had laughed. This afternoon, when it was time for our lesson, he was not laughing. He entered my apartment, carrying a metal rod about 2 feet long, with a leather loop attached. It had a switch in the handle, which could be set to 2 positions, on and off, like a simple torch. He wore another such instrument slung from his belt. "This is not a weapon," he said. "It is not to be used as a weapon." "What is it?" I asked. "A taro goad," he replied. He snapped the switch in the barrel of the on position and struck the table. It showered sparks in a sudden cascade of yellow light, but left the table unmarked. He turned off the goad and extended it to me. As I reached for it, he snapped it on and slapped it into my palm. A billion tiny yellow stars, like pieces of fiery needles, seemed to explode in my hand. I cried out in shock. I thrust my hand in my mouth. It had been a sudden, severe electric charge, like the striking of a snake in my hand. I examined my hand. It was unhurt. Yeah, how can you pad the word count simply saying it's fluent? Yeah, yeah. Getting the sense that Mr. Norman here was paid by the word. I examined my hand. It was unhurt. "Be careful of a targoad," said the older Tarl. "It is not for children." I took it from him, this time being careful to take it near the leather loop, which I fastened around my wrist. The older Tarl was leaving. I understood that I was to follow him. We ascended a spiral staircase inside the cylinder, and climbed for what must have been dozens of apartment levels. At last we emerged on the flat roof of the cylinder. The wind swept across the flat, circular roof, tugging one toward the edge. There was no protective rail. I braced myself, wondering what was to occur. Some dust blew against my face. I shut my eyes. The older Tarl took a tarn whistle, or tarn call, from his tunic and blew a piercing blast. I had never seen one of the taros before, except on the tapestry in my apartment, and in illustrations in certain books I had studied devoted to the care, breeding, and equipment of tarns. Okay, so you'd never seen a tarn before except in books about tarns. I feel like you can just say you never saw one in person before. That I had not been trained for this moment was intentional, as I later discovered. Okay, you studied books on this. That's not training per se, but that's clearly education. You're not approaching this from zero knowledge about Tarns, is what I'm getting at. Yeah, there's your burb. Yeah, here we go. The Gorians believe, incredibly enough, that the capacity to master a tam is innate, and that some men possess this characteristic and some do not. One does not learn to master a tear. It is a tear, a tarn. They have They've spelled this thing about 4 different ways right now, and I'm convinced only some of them are typos. A bird, also a government drone. Starting to feel like it. It is a matter of blood and spirit, of beast and man, of a relation between two beings which must be immediate, intuitive, and spontaneous. It is said that a tam, here we go again, knows who is a Tarnsman and who is not, and that those who are not die in this first meeting. Okay, you know what? This gets a drink. My first impression was that of a rush of wind and a great snapping sound, as if a giant might be snapping an enormous towel or scarf. Then I was cowering, awe-stricken, in the great wing's shadow, and an immense tarp, his talons extended like gigantic steel hooks, his wings sputtering fiercely in the air, hung above me, motionless except for the beating of his wings. "Stand clear of the wings!" shouted the older Tarl. I needed no urging. I darted from under the bird. One stroke of those wings would hurl me yards from the top of the cylinder. The Tam, he's switching between spellings like 3 different times to 3 different spellings each. This has to be some. I don't know. There has to be some mixing and matching of terms here. Anyway, the Tam dropped to the roof of the cylinder and regarded us with his bright black eyes. Bright black eyes, huh? Alright. Through the Tarn, though the Tarn, like most birds, is surprisingly light for his size, this primarily having to do with the comparative hollowness of the bones, it is an extremely powerful bird, powerful even beyond what one would expect from such a monster. Whereas large earth birds, such as the eagle, must, when taking flight from the ground, begin with a running start, the Tarn, with its incredible musculature, sudden flurry of its giant wings, lift both himself and his rider into the air. In Gorian, these birds are sometimes spoken of as brothers of the wind. Yo, Tarl, what happened to my son? The boy has passed judgment. Yeah, I know, seriously. There's like so many things, so many bad things can happen to this apparent child of destiny. Jesus Christ. The plumage of Tarns is various, and they are bred for their colors as well as their strength and intelligence. Black Terrors are used for night raids, while Taros in the winter campaigns, and multicolored resplendent Terrors are bred for warriors who wish to ride proudly, regardless of the lack of camouflage. The most common Tarn, however, is greenish-brown. Disregarding its disproportion in size, the earth bird, which the Tam most closely resembles, is the hawk, with the exception that it is the crest somewhat like the nature of a jay's. That's an excellent question. My mind immediately goes to chicken, obviously, but I feel like this would be slightly gamier than that, because this thing clearly is meant to be a mount and possible beast of burden. So probably something like, I don't know. I'm imagining something like some kind of long distance fowl or something. I imagine it's going to taste like a duck. Anyway, Taros, who are vicious things, are seldom more than half tamed, and like their diminutive earthly counterparts, the hawks are carnivorous. It is not unknown for a Tarn to attack and devour his own rider. They fear nothing but the Taro goad. They are trained by men of the caste of Tarn keepers to respond to it while still young, when they can be fastened by wires to the training perches. When a young bird soars away or refuses some obedience in some fashion, he is dragged back to the perch and beaten with a Taro goad. Chicken or white meat burbs, you want a dark meat burb comparison, like a duck. Yeah, they taste like dinosaurs. Okay, whenever a young bird soars away or refuses obedience in some fashion, he's dragged back to the perch and beaten with a taro goad. Rings, comparable to those which are fastened on the legs of the young birds, are worn by the adult birds to reinforce the memory of the hobbling wire in the taro goad. Later, of course, the adult birds are not fastened, but the conditioning given to them in youth usually holds, except when they become abnormally disturbed or have not been able to obtain food. The tam is one of the most two common mounts of a Gorian warrior. The other is the high Tharlarion, a species of saddle lizard used mostly by clans who have never mastered tars. No one in the city of Cylinders, as far as I knew, maintained Tharlarians, though they were supposedly quite common on Gor, particularly in the lower areas, in swampland and on the deserts. The older Tarl had mounted his tear, climbing on the 5-rung leather mounting ladder, which hangs on the left side of the saddle and is pulled up in flight. He fastened himself in the saddle with a broad purple strap. He tossed me in. Hang on a second. Which hangs. Okay, yeah. I thought it was tense switching for a second there. He tossed me a small object which nearly fell from my fumbling hands. It was a tam whistle, with its own note, which would summon one tarn and one tam only. Okay, we're switching spellings in the same sentence, like in the next sentence fragment. That deserves a drink. He must have written this while he was tired. Or possibly wasted himself. Anyway, right, it's a tam whistle with its own note, which would summon one tarn and one tam only, the mount which was intended for me. Never since the panic of the disoriented compass back in the mountains of New Hampshire had I been so frightened, but this time I refused to allow my fear the fatal inch it required. If I was to die, it would be. If I was not to die, I would not. I smiled to myself in spite of my fear, amused at the remark I had addressed to myself. It sounded like something out of the Code of the Warrior, something which, if taken literally, would seem to encourage its believer to take not the slightest or most sane precautions for his safety. I blew a note on the whistle, and it was shrill and different, of a new pitch from that of the old tarl. Almost immediately from somewhere, perhaps from a ledge out of sight, rose a fantastic object, another great tar, perhaps even larger than the first, a glossy and sable tam, which circled the cylinder once and then wheeled toward me, landing a few feet away, his talons striking the roof with a sound like hurled gauntlets. His talons were shed with steel, a war tarn. He raised his curved beak to the sky and screamed, lifting and shaking his wings. Tarn versus Tam seems like an OCR issue. Quite possibly. Let's see, shaking his wings. His enormous head turned towards me, and period, his round, wicked eyes blazed in my direction. The next thing I knew, his beak was open. I caught a brief sight of his thin, sharp tongue, as long as a man's arm, darting out and back, and then snapping at me. He lunged forward, striking at me with that monstrous beak, and I heard the older Tarl cry out in horror, "The goad! The goad!" And that's the end of the chapter. Next chapter. Chapter 4, the mission. Okay, so it ends on a cliffhanger. Awesome. Okay, I threw my right arm up to protect myself, the goad, attached by its strap to my wrist, flying wildly. I seized it, using it like a puny stick, striking at the great snapping beak that was trying to seize me, as if I were a scrap of food on the high, flat plate of the cylinder's roof. He lunged twice, and I struck it twice. He drew back his head again, spreading his beak, preparing to slash downward again. In that instant, I switched the tar goad to the on position. Okay. You know what? That gets a drink. Yep. Got eaten by the bird. Short story. Interesting world building. Right, anyway. So yeah, when the great beak flashed downward again, I struck it viciously, trying to force it away from me. The effect was startling. There was a sudden bright flash of yellow glittering light, a splash of sparks, and a scream of pain and rage from the tam as he immediately beat his wings, lifting himself out of my reach in a rush of air that nearly forced me over the edge of the roof. I was on my hands and knees, trying to get back on my feet, too near the edge. Boy was doing his best to save us from any further suffering. He's trying. Hands and knees, trying to get back on my feet to the edge, circling the cylinder, utterly piercing cries. Then he began to fly away from the city. Without knowing why, and thinking I was better off to have the thing in retreat, I seized my tam whistle and blew its shrill note. The giant bird seemed almost shudder in the air. Then he reeled, losing altitude, gaining it again. If he had not been simply a winged beast, I would have believed him to be struggling with himself, a creature locked inwardly in mental torture. It was the wild nature of the Tarn, the call of the distant hills, the open sky, against the puny conditioning he had been subjected to, against the will of tiny men with their private objectives, their elementary psychology of stimulus and response, their training wares and tarot goads. At last, with a wild cry of rage, the tam returned to the cylinder. I seized the short mounting ladder swinging wildly from the saddle and climbed it, seating myself in the saddle, fastening the broad purple belt that would keep me from tumbling to my death. The tarn is guided by virtue of a throat strap, to which are attached normally 6 leather streamers or reins. Trying to beat into submission something that is fairly intelligent and physically superior to you is a very bad idea. Yeah, I feel like this thing, there's no reason this would subject to conditioning in this fashion. Like, if it is not already docile, it's not going to respond to a horn or whistle or any kind of command. Certainly, zapping it is not going to get it to cooperate. It's viewing you as a hostile entity at that point. Let's see. Accordingly, the mechanics are simple. One draws on the streamer or rein, which is attached to the ring most nearly approximating the direction in which one wishes to go. For example, to land or lose altitude, one uses the fore strap, which exerts pressure on the fore ring, which is located beneath the throat of the tarn. To rise in flight or gain altitude, one draws on the one strap, which exerts pressure on the one ring. God Almighty, this is talking about the mechanics of controlling this fucking thing. This is actually getting boring. I'm in danger of lowering the threat level from this thing. Anyway, the throat strap rings, corresponding to the position of the reins of the main saddle ring, are numbered in a clockwise fashion. The tam goad is also occasionally used in guiding the bird. One strikes the bird in the direction opposite with one wishes to go. Okay, so we're just zapping this poor thing. Like, to get it to go forward, we're zapping this thing in the ass, basically. Like, there's some animal cruelty happening here, with a thing that could very easily disembowel you if it's pissed off from the sound of it. Okay, the bird withdrawing from the goad moves in that direction. There's very little precision in this method, however, because the reactions of the bird are merely instinctive, and he may not withdraw in the exact tangent desired. Moreover, there is danger in using the goad excessively. It tends to become less effective if often used, and the rider is then at the mercy of the taro. Yeah, don't stick the electric cattle prod in the cloaca. Also, I'm trying to imagine, like, zapping something that you yourself are riding. I feel like there's an issue with conductivity, especially if you're carrying or equipped with a lot of metal. Like, they're not wearing full plate armor. They talked about the armor not being a thing, but you're carrying metal weapons. You really do not want to discharge in a bad direction there. Anyway, I drew back on the one strap and, filled with terror and exhilaration, felt the power of the gigantic wings beating on the invisible air. My body lurched wildly, but the saddle belt held. I couldn't breathe for a minute, but clung, frightened and thrilled, to the saddle ring, my hand wrapped in the one strap. The tarn continued to climb, and I saw the city of cylinders dropping far below me, like a set of rounded children's blocks set in the gleaming green hills. I had never experienced anything like this, and if man ever felt godlike, I suppose I did in those first savage, exhilarating moments. I looked below and saw the older Tarl, mounted on his own tarn, climbing to overtake me. When he was near, he shouted to me, the words merry but indistinct in the rush of air. "Ho, child!" he called. "Do you seek to climb to the moons of Gor?" I suddenly realized I felt dizzy, or slightly so, but the magnificent black tarn was still climbing, though now struggling, his wings beating fiercely with frustrated persistence against the thinning, less resistant air. The hills and plains of Gore were a blaze of colors far below me. Okay, I feel like a bird reaching altitudes. I feel like a bird could not be conditioned to fly to that altitude. That would be. We're talking about getting to the cruising altitude of your average airliner. I feel like this is not something it could be forced to do unless it already regularly does that. Yeah, passed by undomesticated F-22 Raptor. A god? Let me show you what it's like to feel like a god. Yeah, look what they need to imitate a fraction of our power. God almighty. It seemed almost as if I could see the curve of the world. The hills and plains of Gore were a blaze of colors far below me, and it may have been my imagination, but it seemed almost as if I could see the curve of the world. The other, passing by undomesticated F-22. Could someone please intercept me? I realize now it must have been the thin air and excitement. Fortunately, before losing consciousness, I drew in the fore strap, and the tam leveled out and then lifted his wings over his back and dropped like a shrieking hawk, with a speed that left me without a breath in my body. I released the reins, letting them hang on the saddle ring, which is the signal for a constant and straight flight, no pressure on the throat strap. The great tarn snapped his wings out, catching the air under them, and smoothly began to fly a straight course, his wings beating slowly but steadily at a cruising speed that would soon take us far beyond the towers of the city. The older space period space Tarl, who seemed pleased, drew near. He pointed back to the city, which was now several miles in the distance. "I'll race you," I cried. "Agreed," he shouted, wheeling his tam in the distance he spoke, and turning him to the city. I was dismayed. His skill was such that he had taken the lead. Oh, time for a drink? Alright. Not getting channel points? That's odd. Maybe refresh the stream. Might be something going on with Twitch. It's been very weird lately. Anyway, turning into the city, I was dismayed. His skill was such that he had taken a lead that would be impossible to overcome. At last I managed to turn the bird, and we were streaking along in the wake of the older Tarl. Certain of his cries drifted back to us. He was urging his Tarn to greater speed. Hey, Mirage, good to see you. We are at 36 and climbing. We're currently getting an exotic lesson in bird riding, basically. Like, simultaneously, these are things that warriors of the Gor use, but also they are dangerous and unreliable and are likely to kill their rider from time to time. But, of course, our guy here is going to be okay. Anyway, good to see you, Mirage. Hope you're having a good night out there. Certain of his cries drifted back to us. He was urging his Tarn to greater speed by a series of shouts intended to communicate his own excitement to his winged mount. The thought flashed through my mind that Tarns should be trained to respond to voice commands as well as to the numbered straps and the tam goad. That they had not been seemed astounding to me. I shouted to my tam in Gorian and in English, "Harta! Harta! Faster! Faster!" The great bird seemed to sense what I intended, or perhaps it was merely a sudden realization that the other tam was in the lead, but a remarkable transformation swept over my sable-plumed steed. His neck straightened, and his wings suddenly cracked like whips in the sky. His eyes became fiery, and his every bone and muscle seemed to leap with power. In a dizzying minute or two, we had passed the older Tarl, to his amazement, and had settled again in a flurry of wings on top of the old cylinder from which we had departed a few minutes ago. "By the beard of the priest-kings!" roared the older Tarl as he brought his bird to the roof. "That is a Tarn of Tams!" Okay, yeah. So, like, just like that, he figures out if you talk to your bird, it does better. And this lets him beat the older, experienced rider on his first flight. That gets a drink. Oh, man. We are definitely getting that isekai protagonist takes a little too well to all this vibe from all this. Anyway, the Tarns released winged their way back to the Tam cots, and the older Tarl and I descended to my apartment. He was bursting with pride. Whoop, thanks for the pat, Ivory. "What a Tam!" he marveled. I had a full pasang start, and yet you passed me." The pasang is a measure of distance on Gor, equivalent to that approximately to .7 of a mile. That Tarn, he said. Okay, hold on a minute. Whoa, 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 whoa. What Englishman is using mile here? I call bullshit. I mean, I know he was in the States, but come on now. Let me see your passport, sir. Anyway, that Tarn, he said, was bred for you, specially selected from the best broods of the finest of our war Tarns. It was with you in mind that the keepers of the Tarns worked, breeding and crossbreeding, training and retraining. Tarn of 10. I have the question, how much control over the performance of a bird would a bird rider even have? Yeah. Again, I feel like you are at this thing's mercy, and it suffers you only so long as it absolutely has to. Anyway, I said, on the roof it would kill me. It seems the Tarn keepers do not train their prodigies as well as they thought. "No," cried the older Tarl. "The training is perfect. The spirit of the Tarn must not be broken, not that of a war Tarn. He is trained to the point where it is necessary for a strong master to determine whether he shall serve him or slay him. You will come to know your Tarn, and he will come to know you. You will be as one in the sky, the Tar the body, you the mind and will. You will live in an armed truce with the Tarn. If you become weak and helpless, he will kill you. As long as you remain strong, his master, he will serve you, respect you, obey you." He paused. "We were not sure of you." I nearly lost control there. John Carter of Mars sometime. Yeah, like we were just talking about that. Like, this is giving me that vibe, but without any kind of editorial pass and a whole bunch of technical details that just do not work out. And we haven't even gotten to the really questionable stuff this series is famous for. Like, I'm losing it over just the structure and grammar or lack thereof of this thing. Anyway, right. "We were not sure of you, your father, and yourself, but today I am sure. You have mastered a Tarn, a war Taro. In your veins must flow the blood of your father, once Ubar, war chieftain, now administrator of Koroba, the city of cylinders." Ah. So, call back. The old man was talking about himself when he was talking about a warlord. Interesting. I was surprised, for this was the first time I had known my father had been war chieftain of the city, or that he was even now its supreme civil official, or for that matter, the city was named Koroba, the now archaic expression for a village market. Okay, you've been here how long and you didn't even know the name of the city? The Gorians have a habit of not revealing names easily. Well, there you go. For themselves, particularly among the lower castes, they often have a real name and what is called a use name. Often, only the closest relatives know the real name. I feel like that would be exhausting to keep track of. That'd be like if they had internet handles back in the 14th century or whatever. Yeah, the truth is that this is all diegetic representation of the MC's progressive degradation of fluency with English. You know what? I would believe that. That would actually be funny. Like if a story started off in proper English, but then degenerated as they lost the ability to speak in it. Anyway, on the level of the first knowledge, it is maintained that knowing the real name gives one power over a person, a capacity to use that name in spells and insidious magical practices. Perhaps something of the same sort lingers even on our native Earth, where the first name of a person is reserved for use by those who know him intimately and presumably wish him no harm. Yeah, it's the old fanfiction-y thing. Getting that. Very much getting that vibe here. The second name, which would correspond to the use name on Gor, is common property, a public sound not sacred or to be protected. At the level of the second knowledge, of course, the high caste, at least in general, recognize the baseless superstition of the lower castes and use their own names comparatively freely, usually followed by the name of their city. Okay, so all that shit is pointless. Like, this is just something to keep the rubes in line, and the people that run the place just don't even bother with this use name stuff. Anyway, for example, I would have given my name as Tarl Cabot of Koroba, or more simply as Tarl of Koroba. The lower caste, incidentally, commonly believe that the names of the high caste are actually used names. The high caste conceal their real names. You know what? All this shit needs a drink. ElfQuest has this mechanic. Yeah. I mean, you could build something on the idea that you have a public-facing identity and your true identity, but this is just super clumsily handled. Is second knowledge the same thing as double knowledge, or is it a different kind of deluxe knowledge? Oh god, you're right. I completely glossed over that at the level of the second knowledge, but that's different from the double knowledge that was said earlier. You know what? That's another drink. Yeah, Gaius Julius Caesar et al. Quite. Oh god. Let's see. Lower caste, incidentally, commonly believe the names of the high caste are actually used names. Our discussion terminated abruptly. There was a rush of wings outside the window of my apartment, and the older Tarl flung himself across the room and dragged me to the floor. At the same moment, the iron bolt of a crossbow, hey, we're finally getting some action here, fired through one of the narrow windows, struck the wall behind my chair stone, and ricocheted viciously around the room. I caught a glimpse of a black helmet through the port as a warrior, still clutching a crossbow and mounted on his taro, hauled up the one strap and flew from the window. There were shouts, and rushing to the window, I saw several answering bolts leave the cylinder and fly in the direction of the retreating assailant, who was now almost half a pasang away and making good of his escape. Is double knowledge the two-part amalgam of the first and second knowledge? You know what? Possibly. But also, I like how nobody heard this fucking thing coming. A member of the cast of assassins, said the older Tarl, gazing at the retreating speck in the distance. Marlenus, who would be Ubar of all Gor, knows of your existence. Who is Marlenus? I asked, shaken. You will learn in the morning, said the older Tarl. Like, I feel like you could tell him now is the thing. This feels like pertinent information. And in the morning you will learn why you've been brought to Gor. Why can't I know now? I demanded. Because the morning will come soon enough, said the older Tarl. I looked at him. Yes, he said. Tomorrow will be soon enough. And tonight? I asked. Tonight we will get drunk. You know what? That's fair. Let's do another drink. Yeah, double knowledge, not knowledge, but rather knowledge and knowledge. Yeah, we're getting into known knowns and unknown unknowns. Anyway, in the morning, I awoke on the sleeping mat in the corner of my apartment, cold and shivering. It was shortly before dawn. I turned off the power switch on the mat and folded back its blanket sides. It was chilly to the touch now, because I had set the chronometric temperature device to turn cold an hour before the first light. One has little inclination to remain in a freezing bed. I decided I disapproved of the Gorian devices for separating mortals from their beds as much as I loathed the alarm clocks and clock radios of my own world. Dilute those percentages. Oh yeah. Drink time, finally. Oh yeah. Let's see. A little inclination to remain in a freezing bed. Disapproved. Blah blah blah. I had a headache like the beating of spears on a bronze shield. A headache that drove all lesser considerations, such as the attempt on my life yesterday, from my mind. The planet might be exploding, and a man would stop to remove a burr from his sandal. I sat up cross-legged on the mat, which is now returning to the room temperature. I struggled to my feet and staggered to the laving bowl on the table and splashed some water on my face. Yeah, chronometric device. Yeah, you can just say timer, my dude. You haven't degenerated that badly in a few weeks. I could remember something of the night before, but not much. The older Tarl and I had made a round of taverns in the various cylinders, and I recall toddling precariously, singing obscene camp lyrics along different narrow bridges about a yard wide without rails, and the earth somewhere below. How far I had no idea at that time. If we were on the high bridges, it would have been more than 1,000 feet away. The older Tarl and I may have drunk too much of that fermented brew concocted with fiendish skill from the yellow grain, Satarna, and called Pagar Satarna, pleasure of the life daughter, but always Pagar for short. Like, we keep going into these insane tangents. Like, these little details that don't matter. This is just. Oh, man. I'm actually hoping for some awkward BDSM stuff just to be less. I feel like it would be less cringe than what we're dealing with here. This world building is actively triggering me. Anyway, I remembered, too, the girls in the last tavern, if it was a tavern, lascivious in their dancing silks. Oh, here we go. Pleasure slaves bred like animals for passion. If there were natural slaves and natural freemen, as the older Tarl had insisted, those girls were natural slaves. Okay. Yep, we're... Okay, here we go. Okay, that's a drink. And I think we need to elevate the threat level here. We are going up to watching Naked Lunch on a concerning amount of LSD. Okay. It was impossible to conceive of them as other than they had been, but somewhere they too must be awakening painfully, struggling to their feet, needing to clean themselves. One in particular I remembered, young, her body like a cheetah, her black hair wild on her brown shoulders, the bangles on her ankles, their sound in the curtained alcove. I found the thought crossing my mind that I would like to have owned that one for more than the hour I had paid for it. I was gonna say it only gets infamous later on in the series, but I guess not. Oh yeah, we are fucking... Here we fucking go. Yeah, this Earthman is from 1966. Oh, that was written here. I think, God, when did this start? It was like 70s, I think? When was it written? Or what is the time set? I want to say... No, you're right. I think it is in the 60s as well. Oh, man. Okay, I would like to have owned that one for more than the hour I had paid for. I shook the thought from my aching head, making an unsuccessful effort to muster a decent sense of shame, failed, and was belting my tunic when the older Tarl entered the room. "We are going to the chamber of the council," he said. I followed him. The chamber of the council is the room in which the elected representatives of the high caste of Koroba, hold their meetings. Each city has such a chamber. It was the widest of the cylinders. It was in the widest of the cylinders, and the ceiling was at least 6 times the height of the normal living level. The ceiling was lit as if by stars, and the walls were of 5 colors, applied laterally, beginning from the bottom: white, blue, yellow, green, and red cast colors. I don't know why this is getting to me. Just, again, working so hard to set a scene, but focusing on the minute details instead of the actual mood and tone of it. Oh, Jesus Christ. We're taking off here. Benches of stone on which the members of the council sat rose in 5 monumental tiers about the walls, one tier for each of the high castes. These tiers shared the color of that portion of the wall behind them, the caste colors. The tier nearest the floor, which denoted some preferential status, the white tier, was occupied by initiates, interpreters of the will of the priest kings. In order, the ascending tiers, blue, yellow, green, and red, were occupied by representatives of the scribes, builders, physicians, and warriors. Torm, I had observed, was not seated in the tier of scribes. I smiled to myself. "I am," Torm had said, "too practical to involve myself in the frivolities of government. I suppose the city might be under siege, and Torm would fail to notice. I was pleased to note that my own caste, that of the warriors, was accorded the least status. If I had had my will, the warriors would not have been a high caste. On the other hand, I objected to the initiates being in the place of honor, as it seemed to me that they, even more than the warriors, were non-productive members of society. God. Okay. We spent an entire chapter on boring, like, macro scale falconry, and now we've got this going on. Uh, for the warriors, at least, one could say that they afforded protection to the city, but for the initiates, one could say very little, perhaps only that they provided some comfort for ills and plagues largely of their own manufacture. In the center of the amphitheater was a throne of office, and on this throne, in his robe of state, a plain brown garment, the humblest cloth in the hall, sat my father, administrator of Koroba, once Ubar war chieftain of the city. At his feet lay a helmet, shield, spear, and sword. "Come forward, Tarl Cabot," said my father, and I stood before his throne of office, feeling the eyes of everyone in the chamber on me. Behind me stood the older Tarl. I had noted those. I had noted that those blue. Okay, I had noted those blue, and then there's a paragraph break, and the next sentence starts with Viking eyes showed. The next paragraph starts with Viking eyes showed almost no evidence of the previous night. I hated him briefly. The older Tarl was speaking. "I, Tarl, swordsman of Koroba, give my word that this man is fit to become a member of the high caste warriors. My father answered him, speaking in ritual phrases. "No tower at Koroba is stronger than that of the word of Tarl, the swordsman of our city. I, Matthew Cabot of Koroba, accept his word." Okay, you know what? I'll do a drink there since your points aren't working. Okay, then, beginning with the lowest tier, each member of the council spoke in succession, giving his name, pronouncing that he, too, accepted the word of the blonde swordsman. When they had finished, my father invested me in the arms which had been laid before the throne. About my shoulder, he slung the steel sword, fashioned on my left arm the round shield, placed on my right hand the spear, and slowly lowered the helmet on my head. "Will you keep the code of the warrior?" asked my father. "Yes," I said, "I will keep the code." "What is your home stone?" asked my father. Sensing what was wanted, I replied, "My home stone is the home stone of Koroba." "Is it to the city that you pledge your life, your honor, and your sword?" asked my father. "Yes," I said. "Then," said my father, placing his hand solemnly on my shoulders, "in virtue of my authority as administrator of this city and in the presence of the Council of the High Castes, I declare you to be a warrior of Koroba." Yep, home stone mentioned. My father was smiling. I removed my helmet, feeling proud as I had the approval of the council, both in voice and by Gorian applause. The quick, repeated striking of the left shoulder with the palm of the right hand. Aside from candidates for the status of warrior, none of my caste was permitted to enter the council armed. Had they been armed, my caste brothers in the last tier would have struck their spear blades on their shields. As it was, they smote their shoulders in the civilian manner, more exuberantly perhaps, than was comparable with the decorum of that waiting chamber. More drink? Alright. Okay, smote their shoulders. Somehow I had the feeling they were genuinely proud of me, though I had no idea why. I had surely done nothing to warrant their commendation. With the older Tarl, I left the chamber of the council and entered a room off the chamber to wait for my father. In the room was a table, and on the table was a set of maps. The older Tarl immediately went to the maps, and calling me to his side, began to pore over them, pointing out this mark and that. "And there," he said, poking downward with his finger, "is the city of Ar, hereditary enemy of the Koroba, the central city of Marlenus, who intends to be Ubar of all Gor. This has something to do with me?" "Bro, that was the assassin that they sent after you." Yes, he said. "You were going to R. You were going to steal the homestone of R and bring it to the Koroba." Alright. What time are we looking at? We are not chapter 5. I'll go for at least one more, and we'll see if this gets to any of the really shocking stuff. Anyway, chapter 5. Lights of the Planting Feast. I mounted my Tarn, that fierce, black, magnificent bird. My shield and spear were secured by saddle straps. My sword was slung over my shoulder. On each side of the saddle hung a missile weapon, a crossbow with a quiver of a dozen quarrels, or boats, on the left, a longbow with a quiver of 30 arrows on the right. Yeah, this is a hazing ritual. Getting that vibe here. The saddle pack contained the light gear carried by raiding Tarnsmen, rations, a compass, maps, binding fiber, and extra bowstrings. Bound in the saddle in front of me, drugged, her head completely covered with a slave hood buckled under her chin, was a girl. It was Sana, the tower slave whom I had seen on my first day in Gor. Oh boy. So he gets his own slave for the ride. Fantastic. I waved a farewell to the older Tarl and to my father, drew back on the one strap, and was off, leaving the tower and their tiny figures behind me. I leveled the Tarn and drew on the sixth strap, setting my course for R. As I passed this cylinder in which Torm kept his scrolls, I was happy to catch a glimpse of the little scribe standing at his rough-hewn window. I now realize he may have been waiting there for hours. He lifted his blue-clad arm in a gesture of farewell, rather sadly. I went to look up what the Homestone is and found a fan site written in the same vibe as the book. Oh yeah, there is a weird subculture that sprung up around this that I am not in any way qualified to dip into. Suffice to say, people apparently got into this in a weird and concerning way. Anyway, right. I waved back at him and then turned my eyes from Koroba and toward the hills beyond. I felt little of the exhilaration I had felt in my first soaring venture on the back of the Tarn. I was troubled and angry, dismayed at the ugly details of the project before me. I thought of the innocent girl bound senseless before me. How surprised I had been when she appeared in the small room outside the chamber of the council after my father. She had knelt at his feet in the position of the tower slave as he had explained to me the plan of the council. The power of Marlenius, or much of it, lay in the mystique of victory that had never ceased to attend him, acting like a magic spell on his soldiers and the people of his city. It's a weird BDSM community, and the actual BDSM community just awkwardly tries to not make eye contact with. Yeah, yeah. I get a lot. Again, I get a lot of 50 Shades of Grey vibe from the people that follow this. Like the actual people that know what they're doing just like view this with contempt. Anyway, right. So yeah, never defeated in combat, Ubar or Ubars, he had boldly refused to relinquish his title after a valley war some 12 years ago, and his men had refused to withdraw from him, refused to abandon him to the traditional fate of the overambitious Ubar. The soldiers and the council of his city had succumbed to his blandishments. Is that a word? I'll assume it is, but his promises of wealth and power for R. Indeed, it seemed their confidence had been well placed, for now R, instead of being a single beleaguered city like so many others on Gor, was a central city in which were kept the homestones of a dozen hitherto free cities. Mostly found infesting Second Life. God, I can't believe that's still a thing. There was now an empire of R, a robust, arrogant, warlike polity only too obviously involved in the work of dividing its enemies and extending its political hegemony city by city across the plains, hills, and deserts of Gor. Blandishment is a rare word for flattery. Alright, fair enough. In a matter of time, Korabab would be forced to match its comparatively handful of Tarnsmen against those of the Empire of R. My father, in his office as administrator of Koraba, had attempted to develop an alliance with R, but the free cities of Gor had, in their pride and suspicion, their almost fanatical commitment to protecting their own independent destinies, refused the alliance. Okay, in their pride and suspicion, their almost fanatical commitment to protecting their own independent destinies refused the alliance. Indeed, they had, in the fashion of Gor, driven my father's envoys from their council chambers with the whips normally used on slaves, an insult which, in another time, would have been answered by the war call of Koroba. Okay, yep. Like, the thing about the slavery on this is the casualness with which they are treating it and the implied horror that it involves. Like, obviously, our protagonist is still new to all this, but it speaks to how low they are down the totem pole that this is the way they're treated. And, fair play, that is in line with slavery here on Earth. But I feel like based on where the series supposedly goes, that speaks ill of what is in store for our protagonist here. Kitty Snoot booped me right in the glasses. That's cute. Yeah, the little smudge there. Anyway, right. Would have answered by the war call of Koraba, but as my father knew, strife among the free cities would be the very madness which Marlenus of R would welcome the most. Better even that Koraba, excuse me, should suffer the indignity of being thought a city of cowards. Yet if, yet if the homestone of R, the very symbol and significance of the Empire, could be removed from R, the spell of Marlenus might be broken. He would become a laughing stock, suspect to his own men, a leader who had lost the homestone. He would be fortunate if he was not publicly impaled. Okay, so he fought off the challengers, presumably in some kind of physical contest, but losing the homestone is enough of an insult. Yeah, Nat Turner or John Brown, this guy ain't. Yeah, getting that. The girl on the saddle before me stirred, the effect of the drug wearing off. She moaned softly and leaned back against me. As soon as we had taken flight, I had unfastened the restraining straps on her legs and wrists, leaving only the broad belt with lashed her securely to the back of the tear. I would not permit the plan of the council to be followed completely, not in her case, even though she had agreed to play her part in the plan, knowing it meant her life. I knew little more about her than her name, Sana, and the fact that she was a slave from the city of Thentius. The older Tarl had told me that Thentius is a city famed for its terraflox and remote in the mountains from which the city takes its name. Raiders from R had struck the tarp flocks and the outlying cylinders of Thentis, and the girl had been captured. She had been sold in R on the day of the love feast and had been purchased by an agent of my father. Oh, that's a double drink there. Love feast. Holy shit. That paints a picture. Oh, man. He, in accordance with the plan of the council, had need of a girl who would be willing to give her life to be avenged on the men of R. I could not help feeling sorry for her, even in the Stein word of Gor. She had been through too much and was clearly not of the stock of the tavern girls. Slavery would not have been a good life for her. Oh, yeah, yeah, like, it wouldn't have been good for her, but clearly is good for some on this planet, as it might have been for them. Oh, man, we're close to raising the threat level here. Let's see. I felt that somehow, in spite of her collar, she was free. I felt this even when my father had commanded her to rise and submit to me, accepting me as her new master. Yeah, homestones are just flags and capture the flag. Yeah, people don't know this, but all you gotta do is capture the homestone and you win. Oh man. Okay, she had risen and walked across the room, her feet bare on the stone floor, and dropped to her knees before me, lowering her head and lifting and extending her hands to me, the wrists crossed. The ritual significance of the gesture of submission was not lost on me. Her wrists were offered to me as if for binding. Her part of the plan was simple, though ultimately fatal. The homestone of R, like most homestones in these cylinder cities, was kept free in the tallest tower, as if in open defiance of the Tarnsman of rival cities. It was a. Uh, okay, yeah. Not keeping this anywhere, like, secure, but yeah, just sticking it on a tower where people with flying mounts can conceivably come and take it. It was, of course, kept well guarded, and at the first sign of serious danger would undoubtedly be kept to safety. Any attempt on the homestone was regarded by citizens of a city as sacrilege of the most heinous variety and punishable by the most painful of deaths, but paradoxically, was regarded as the greatest of glories to purloin the homestone of another city, and the warrior who managed this was acclaimed, according to the highest honors of the city, and was believed to be favored by the priest kings themselves. If it's in a safe, then how do people admire it and know that it's there? Yeah, fair enough. You know, this really is a giant planetary game of capture the flag. The homestone of a city is the center of various rituals. The next would be the planting feast of Satarna, the Life Daughter, celebrated early in the growing season to ensure a good harvest. This is a complex feast celebrated by most Gorian cities, and the observances are numerous and intricate. People die by giant bird poop? Almost certainly. That's happened at least once. The details of the rituals are arranged and mostly executed by the initiates of a given city. Certain portions of the ceremonies, however, are often allotted to members of the high castes. In R, for example, early in the day, a member of the builders would go to the roof on which the homestone is kept and place the primitive symbol of his trade, a metal angle square, before the stone, praying to the priest kings for the prosperity of his caste in the coming year. Later in the day, a warrior will, similarly, place his arms before the stone, to be followed by other representatives of each caste. Okay, we're getting into the specifics of a ritual on the way to steal the homestone. Like, is this going to be relevant? Is this some kind of Ocean's 11 thing where they lay out the information ahead of time and only towards the end do you see where it all comes together? I'm having a hard time following where the action is in this. Like, where are we in this scene? I suppose he's just kind of reflecting on this information as he's flying out. Anyway, most significantly, while these members of the high caste perform their rituals of their portions of the ritual, the guards of the homestone temporarily withdraw to the interior of the symbol, leaving the celebrant, it is said, alone with the priest kings. Okay, you have to take the homestone in between the prayers. Yeah, all right. So I am starting to see where this is coming here. Lastly, as the culmination of R's planting feast, and of the greatest importance to the plan of the Council of Koroba, a member of the Ubar's family goes to the roof at night, under the 3 full moons with which the feast is correlated, and casts grain upon the stone, and drops of a red wine-like drink, made from the fruit of the Kalana tree. The member of the Ubar's family then prays to the priest kings for an abundant harvest, and returns to the interior of the cylinder, at which point the guards of the homestone resume their vigil. This year the honor of the grain sacrifice to be accorded to the daughter of the Ubar. I knew nothing about her, except that her name was Talina, that she was rumored to be one of the beauties of R, and that I was supposed to kill her. Oh, oh wow. Okay. That dialed up real fucking fast. Otherwise, you're going to need to fight the builder and likely depart this world with that primitive metal square lodged in your cranium. Yep. We're doing a switch. We're doing a switcheroo. He's gonna kill the original uh, person giving the grain sacrifice and replace her with a slave woman who is probably also going to die. According to the plan of the Council of Koroba, exactly at the time of the sacrifice, at the 20th Gorkan hour or midnight, I was to drop to the roof of the highest cylinder of an R, slay the daughter of the Ubar, and carry away her body and the homestone, discarding the former in the swamp country north of R, and carrying the latter home to Koroba. The girl, Sana, whom I carried to the saddle before me, would dress in the heavy robes and veils of the Ubar's daughter, and return in her place to the interior of the cylinder. Presumably, it would at least be a matter of minutes before her identity was discovered, and before that, she would take the poison provided by the council. Oh shit, did the stream die? Hang on a second. Alright, I'm repeating this section because it's a fucking doozy here. Like, this is the plan. Okay, so yeah, this year the honor of the grain sacrifice to be accorded to the daughter of the... Okay, I was supposed to kill her. According to the plan of the Council of Koroba, exactly at the time of the sacrifice, at the 20th Gorkan hour, or midnight, I was to drop to the roof of the highest cylinder in R, slay the daughter of the Ubar, and carry away her body and the homestone, discarding the former in the swamp country north of R, and carrying the latter home to Koroba. The girl, Sana, whom I carried on the saddle before me, would dress in the heavy robes and veils of the Ubar's daughter, and return in her place to the interior of the cylinder. Presumably, it would be at least a matter of minutes before her identity was discovered, and before that, she would take the poison provided by the council. Okay, holy shit. So, he's not even doing a switcheroo here. Like, he's going to kill the girl doing the sacrifice, replace her with the slave girl, then fly off with a stone, and let her go in, have her identity discovered. What the man is telling me is that no one is guarding the stone nor the tower. Exactly! Like, he could just fly in and take it. The sacrifice is completely unnecessary here. Like, at best, you have to deal with the girl giving the sacrifice, but nobody's around there. There are no guards. You can just, like, knock her out and fly off before anyone knows you're the wiser. And because you have taught this bird English, you can go faster than other birds. Like, this is completely unnecessary. Yeah, this is... I need to... Oh, yeah, this needs a few drinks. Okay, yeah, we are upping the threat level. Hang on a second. Right. The threat level has been upped. We are at the top. We are at William Shatner's spoken word version of Mr. Tambourine Man. Which, by the way, if you haven't heard that, go do so at some point. Yeah, boy, go faster. Baka! Oh, God. Okay, two girls were supposed to die, that I might have time to escape with the homestone before the alarm could be given. In my heart, I knew I would not carry out this plan. Abruptly, I changed course, drawing on the forestrap, guiding my Tarn towards the blue shimmering wave of a mountain range in the distance. The girl before me groaned and shook herself, her hands, unsteady, going to the slave hood, which was buckled over her head. I helped her unbuckle the hood, and felt delighted at the sudden flash of long blonde hair streaking out beside my cheek. I placed the hood in the saddle pack, admiring her. Not only her beauty, but even more than that, she did not, period, seem frightened. Surely there was enough to frighten any girl, the height at which she found herself, the savage mount on which she rode, the prospect of the terrible fate that she believed to await her at her journey's end. But she was, of course, a girl of mountainous Thentis, famed for its fierce terrorflocks. Such a girl would not frighten easily. She didn't turn to look at me, but she examined her wrists, rubbing them gently. The marks of the original restraining straps, which I had removed, were just visible. You unbound me, she said, and you removed my hood. Why? I thought you would be more comfortable, I replied. You treat a slave with unexpected consideration, she said. Thank you. You're not frightened? I asked, stumbling on the words, feeling stupid. I mean, about the Tarn. You must have ridden Taros before. All right, drink. Okay. The girl looked back at me, puzzled. Women are seldom permitted to ride on the backs of Tarns, she said. In the carrying baskets, but not as warrior rides. Okay, this is it's kind of cute that they train these birds to like carry baskets, and that serves as their passenger transport or slave transport. I mean, the implications are fucked as hell, but something about that visual image is just kind of adorable. Just like this giant raptor eagle just carrying like a wicker basket with people to wherever city it's going. Jesus Christ. Okay, she paused, and the wind whistled past, a steady sound mingling with the rhythmical stroke of the Tarn's beating wings. You said you were frightened when you first rode a Taro, she said. I was, I laughed, recalling the excitement and the sense of danger. Why do you tell a slave that you were frightened? She asked. I don't know, I replied, but I was. She turned her head away again and looked, unseeing, at the head of the great Tarn as he plowed the wind. I did ride once before on the back of a Tarn, she said bitterly, to R, bound across the saddle before I was sold on the street of Brands. Oh, God. You know what? This needs another drink. I gotta finish this fucking chapter. Yeah. He's so cool, he's mildly nice to his slaves. Yeah, like basic considerations. This is how their relationship starts. Okay. He's not gonna like free her or anything. I mean, he said that, but she doesn't know that yet. Anyway, it was not so easy to talk on the back of the Great Taro with the wind, and besides, though I wanted to communicate with the girl, I felt I could not. She was looking at the horizon, and suddenly her body tensed. This is not the way to R, she cried. I know, I said. What are you doing? She turned bodily in the straps, looking at me, her eyes wide. Where are you going, master? The word master, though it had come appropriately enough from the girl, who was legally at least my property, startled me. Okay, that's another drink. Yeah, standard isekai protagonist procedures. Okay, yeah. Don't call me master, I said. But you are my master, she said. I took from my tunic the key my father had given me, the key to Sana's collar. I reached to the lock behind her neck, inserted the key, and turned it, springing open the mechanism. I jerked the collar away from her throat and threw it and the key from the Tarn's back and watched them fly downward in a long, graceful parabola. The parabola. I never know how to pronounce that. Parabola, I assume. You are free, I said, and we are going to Thentis. She sat before me, stunned, her hands unbelievingly at her throat. Why? She asked. Why? Men cannot even comprehend how culturally insensitive to the indigenous population he is right now. Yeah, no kidding. Doesn't he know that slavery is a culturally accepted practice here on Gore? He is not being disrespectful. He is engaging in cultural imperialism. Anyway, what could I tell her? That I come from another world? That I was determined that all the weight is that Gore should not be mine? Or that I had cared for her somehow, so helpless in her condition, that she had moved me to regard her not as an instrumentality of mine or the council, but as a girl, young, rich with life, not to be sacrificed in the games of statecraft? Yeah, he's British. Of all people, he should fucking know a thing or two. You are free, apart from the brand that will forever indicate you that you are a slave. Yeah, about that. Isn't she originally? Isn't she marked by the person she originally is owned by? I feel like we're starting to break the own internal logic of the setting here. He metaphysically cannot understand indigenous culture. Yeah. God, this is really going some fucking places here. Anyway, I have my reasons for freeing you, I said, but I am not sure you would understand them. And I added under my breath to myself that I was not altogether sure I understood them myself. My father, she said, and my brothers will reward you. No, I said. If you wish, they are bound in honor to grant me to you without bride price. uh, okay, so your reward for freeing the slave is a slave. Wow. The ride to Fentis will be long, I said. She replied, I can't even talk anymore now. She replied proudly, my bride price would be $100. Okay, yeah, this is starting to break me. I whistled softly to myself. My ex-slave would have come high. On a warrior's allowance, I would not have been able to afford her. If you wish to land, said Sana, apparently determined to see me compensated in some fashion, I will serve your pleasure. Oh, boy. Get to the end of the chapter. This is dialed up to 11 so fast, it's incredible. It occurred to me that there was at least one reply which she, bred in the honor codes of the Gore, should understand, one reply that should silence her. Would you diminish the worth of my gift to you? I asked, feigning anger. She thought for a moment and then gently kissed me on the lips. No, Tarl Cabot of Koroba, she said, but you well know that I could do nothing that would diminish the worth of your gift to me. Tarl Cabot, I care for you. Yeah, he frees a slave and gets a slave that will serve his pleasure. Here I was expecting silence, Wedge. Yeah, I'm not like those other slave owners. I'm nice. I'm willing to free the slaves. Please be my slave. Oh, Jesus. Yeah, there's a few light novels that begin like this. Yeah, I think this is basically the plot to Venical. Anyway, I realized that she had spoken to me as a free woman, using my name. I put my arms around her, sheltering her as well as I could from the swift, chilling blast of the wind. Then I thought to myself, 100 tarns indeed. 40 perhaps, because she was a beauty. For 100 tarns, one might have the daughter of an administrator. For 1,000, perhaps even the daughter of the Ubar of Ar. 1,000 tarns would make a formidable addition to a cavalry force of a Gorian warlord. Yeah, not really a slave, but acts like a slave. Sana, collar or no, had the infuriating, endearing vanity of the young and beautiful of her sea. What? Okay. Sana, collar or no, had the infuriating, endearing vanity of the young and beautiful of her sea. Yeah, funny you mentioned Evenical. It's by the same company as the Rand series. Oh, holy shit. That explains so goddamn much. Oh, Rance is in a category all its own. I don't think the man understands the economics of having a flock of 1,000 giant birds of prey. Yeah, like where do you house and feed and stable these things? Do you even have that many warriors that can that can make use of this? Like Koroba, I mean I know he's not like considering that, but I don't know. My mind's like a record skipping here. I need to focus on the writing. I need to actually finish this. Yeah. Rant series first entry where a protagonist gets his slave seal released in 1989. Oh man, yeah, I'm sensing some influences here. I'm feeling like there are some unspoken cultural crossover happening. Anyway, God, where was I? Okay, Sana Kalaro no had the infuriating, endearing vanity of the young and beautiful of her sea. I have no idea what that's supposed to refer to. On a tower of Thentis, I left her, kissing her, removing from my neck her clinging hands. She was crying, with all the incomprehensible absurdity of the female kind. God. Yeah, those darn women folk, and they're crying, right? Oh God, I have to read that again. On the Tower of Thentis, I left her, kissing her, removing from my neck her clinging hands. She, she was crying with all the incomprehensible absurdity of the female kind. I hauled the Tarn aloft, waving back at the small figure, still wearing the diagonally striped livery of the slave. Her white arm was lifted, and her blonde hair was swept behind her on the windy roof of the cylinder. I turned the terror toward R. As I crossed the Vosk, that mighty river, some 40 pasangs in width, which hurtles past the frontiers of R to pour into the Tamber Gulf, I realized that I was last within the borders of the Empire of R. Incomprehensible absurdity is trying to grasp Bakemonogatari architecture. Yeah, yeah, like there is some. This is a man encountering a pattern matching error in his brain, and he cannot fathom the behavior he is witnessing in another human being. He doesn't see this. He thinks he's being progressive, is the thing, because he is freeing a slave, and because our hero is freeing a slave, and not recognizing the underlying fuckedness, for lack of a better word, of his the world he's creating. Like, because he's going to be a nicer slaver, for lack of a better word, slave owner, for lack of a better word, that's somehow okay. Oh God, where even was I? Yeah, I've completely lost it. This has busted me. We're not at Atlanta Knights tier, but we are in that ballpark. Okay, right. Okay, as I cross the Vosk, that mighty river, some 40 pasangs in width, which hurtles past the frontiers of R to pour into the Tamber Gulf, I realized that I was at last within the borders of the Empire of R. Sana had insisted that I keep the pellet of poison which the council had given her to spare her from the otherwise inevitable tortures that would follow the disclosure of her identity in the cylinders of R. However, I took the pellet from my tunic and dropped it into the wide waters of the Vosk. It constituted a temptation to which I had no inclination to succumb. If death was easy, I might seek life less strenuously. There would come times when, in my weakness, I would regret my decision. It took 3 days to reach the environs of the city of R. Shortly after crossing the Vosk, I descended and made camp, thereafter traveling only at night. During the day I had freed my Tarn to allow him to free as he would to feed as he would. They are diurnal hunters, and eat only what they catch themselves, usually one of the fleet Gorian antelopes or a wild bull. Yeah, man just committed war crimes against fish. Yeah, just drop poison in the river. That's awesome. Way to go, buddy. Okay, usually on the fleet Gorian antelopes or wild bull, take another run and lift it in the monstrous talons to a high place where it is torn to pieces and devoured. Needless to say, terrors are a threat to any living matter that is luckless enough to fall within the shadow of their wings, even human beings. During the first day, sheltered in the occasional knots of trees that dot the border plains of R, I slept, fed on my rations, and practiced with my weapons, trying to keep my muscles vital in spite of the stiffness that attends prolonged periods on Tarnback. But I was bored. At first, even the countryside was depressing, for the men of R, as a military policy, had devastated an area of some 200 or 300 pasangs on their borders, cutting down fruit trees, filling wells, and salting the fertile areas. R had, for most practical purposes, surrounded itself with an invisible wall, a bleached region, forbidding and almost impassable to those on foot. Okay, so we have people more or less salting the earth around them, and this is how you know they're the bad guys. Like, this gets a drink. Jesus. I was more pleased on the second day and made camp in the grassy veldt, dotted with the kalana trees. The night before, I had ridden over fields of grain, silvery yellow beneath me in the light of the three moons. I kept my course by the luminescent dial of my Gor compass, the needle of which always pointed to the Sardar mountain range, home of the priest kings. Sometimes I guided my tarn by the stars, the same fixed stars I had seen from another angle above my head in the mountains of New Hampshire. The third day's camp was made in the swamp forest that borders the city of R on the north. Yeah, assaulting the earth. Men are committing casual war crimes against the local slug population. Yeah, no kidding. Let's see. Okay, so we're almost at the end of this chapter. Let's see if we can make it through this. Okay, the third day's camp was made in the swamp forest that borders the city of R on the north. I had chosen this area because it is the most uninhabitable area within Tam strength of R. I had seen too many village cooking fires on the last night, and twice I had heard the tarn whistles of nearby patrols, groups of 3 warriors flying their rounds. The thought crossed my mind of giving up the project, turning outlaw, if you will, deserter, if you like, but of saving my own skin, trying to get out of this mad scheme, if only with my life, and that only for a time. But an hour before midnight, on the day I knew was the planting feast of Satarna, I climbed again to the saddle of my Taro, drew back on the one strap, and rose above the lush trees of the swamp forest. Almost simultaneously, I heard the raucous cry of a patrol leader of R. "We have him!" They had followed my tarn, trailing it back from its feeding into the swamp forest, and now, like the points of a rapidly converging triangle, 3 warriors of R were closing in on me. I almost want one more chapter to see how this whole shenanigan pans out and how hard the princess he's not going to moiter falls for him. Oh, God. Yeah, if I had another hour, I'd definitely go one more chapter. We're definitely getting a bit late for that, but I am darkly fascinated by this, I must say. Anyway, uh, right, they'd followed my tarn, trailing it back from its feeding in the swamp forest, and now, like points of a rapidly converging triangle, 3 warriors of R were closing in on me. They apparently had no intention of taking me prisoner, for an instant after the shout, the sharp hiss of a bolt from a crossbow passed over my head. Before I had time to gather my senses, a dark-winged shape had materialized in front of me, and in the light of the 3 moons, I saw a warrior on a tarn passing, thrusting out with his spear. He unslaved the slave and left her out in the wild where she would most definitely not get recaptured. Yeah, I'm feeling like this is going to end with him having to rescue her again and again, proving that he's a worthy slave owner. But, we're not going to call it slavery. Anyway, he surely would have struck home had not my tarn veered wildly to the left, almost colliding with another tarn and its rider, who fired a bolt that sank deep in the saddle pack with a sound like slapping leather. The third of the warriors of R was sweeping in from behind. I turned, raising the tar goad, which was looped to my wrist, to ward off the stroke of his blade. Sword and turn goad. Okay, that's not even the usual spelling of tarn or tear or tam. That's just turn. That gets a drink. Okay, sword and turn goad met in a ringing clash and a shower of glittering yellow sparks. Somehow I must have turned the goad on. Both my tarn and that of the attacker withdrew as if by instinct from the flash of the goad, and I had inadvertently purchased a moment of time. I unslung my longbow and fitted an arrow, yanking my tam in an abrupt wing-shuddering arc. I think, I think the first of my pursuers had not realized I would turn the bird. He had been expecting a chase. The end of slavery, be the man that would invent cat ear headbands. Oh man! As I passed him, I saw his eyes wide in the Y of his helmet, as in that split second he knew I could not miss. I saw him stiffen suddenly in the saddle, and was dimly aware of his tarn streaking away, screaming. Now the other 2 men of the patrol were circling for their attack. They swept toward me. Okay, it doesn't actually say that he fired a shot. Like he passed him, he saw the dude. He saw the dude by the whites of his eyes, but he doesn't actually say he let loose. It just says I saw him stiffen suddenly in the saddle and was dimly aware of his tarn streaking away. He drowns you in detail that is completely unnecessary and then skimps on it when the action is happening. It's very, very strange writing. Anyway, Now the other 2 men of the patrol were circling for their attack. They they swept toward me, about 5 yards apart, to close on either side of me, to force the wings of my Tarn up and hold it for the moment they, would need, trapped motionless between their own mounts. I had no time to think, but somehow I was aware that my sword was now in my hand and the Taro goad thrust in my belt. As we crashed in the air, I sharply jerked back the one strap, bringing the steel-shod talons of my war Tarn into play. And to this day I bless the Tam Keepers of the Koroba for the painstaking training they had given the great bird. Or perhaps I should bless the fighting spirit of that plumed giant, my war Tarn, that terrible thing that the older Tarl had called a Tarn of Turns. Oh God. Tarl of Turns. This is a tongue twister. Perhaps I should bless the fighting spirit of that plumed giant, my war Tarn, that terrible thing called that the older Tarl had called a Tarn of Turns. Jesus Christ. Beak and talons rendering. Yeah, yeah, I'm hurting from this. This is deep hurting. Beak and talons rending, uttering ear-shattering screams, my tams slashed at the other two birds. I crossed swords with the nearer of the two warriors. In a brief passage, that's intentional, is in the text, that could have lasted only an instant. I was suddenly aware, dizzily conscious, that one of the enemy Tarns was sinking downward, flopping wildly, falling into the recesses of the swamp forest below. Okay, yeah, so he's doing that anime thing where they, like, dart past each other and cross swords. It's a single stroke, and then after, a minute's pause, one of them falls. That's kind of the visual I'm getting here. The other warrior pulled his Tarn about as if for another passage at arms, but then, as if suddenly realizing that his duty was to give the alarm, Lai shouted at me in rage and wheeled his Tar again, streaking for the lights of R. With his start, he would be confident. Oh, here we go. But I knew that my Tarn could overtake him easily. I brought my Tarn into line with a retreating speck and gave him his rein. As we neared the fleeing warrior, I fitted a second arrow to my bow. Rather than kill the warrior, I loosed the arrow into the wing of the Tarn. The Tar spun about, and began to favor the injured wing. The warrior could no longer control the mount, and I saw the Tar dripping awkwardly, descending in drunken circles to the darkness below. I drew back on the one strap, and when we had climbed to a height where my breath had come in gasps, I leveled our course for R. I wished to fly above the normal patrol runs. I don't think you could actually do this because the boy wings would get in the way. Yeah. Near R, I crouched low in the saddle and hoped that the speck against the moon, which might be seen by the watchmen of the outlying towers, would be taken for a wild Tarn flying high over the city. The city of R must have contained more than 100,000 cylinders, each ablaze with the lights of the planting feast. I did not question that R was the greatest city in all of known Gor. It was a magnificent and beautiful city, a worthy setting for the jewel of an empire. That awesome jewel that had proved so tempting to its Ubar, that all-conquering Marlenis. And now down there, somewhere in that monstrous blaze of light, was a humble piece of stone, the homestone of that great city, and I must seize it. Oh, Lord. And that finishes our drink with a nice, not even 69. Nice. That brings us to Chapter 6, Nar the Spider, which sounds incredibly promising, but that is where we must call it. Yeah, Englishman sees an empire, damn that shit's cool. Yeah, he's like, see, these guys got it figured out. Oh, God. This was an experience. Like, I can already feel the creepy sex shit, like, working its way in, and the course of the protagonist as they try to separate themselves, inevitably reinforcing the culture they think they're defying. But what I was not prepared for was just the awful, awful nature of the structure and the mechanical structure of the writing itself. Like the way it builds scenes, the way it shifts from exposition dumps to present tense happenings, the dialogue being weird and stilted. the protagonist feels like such a non-character. For all we know about them, I don't get anything about them except the fact that they're an Englishman and they find slavery nominally distasteful, but of course they're going to take one he's going to take one for himself, as a treat. Yeah, I'm going to plunder their heritage items. I get the feeling this is where it's going. He's going to go on safari at one point and be like, Korthos, hand me my anti-Tarn gun or something. Only they can't call it a gun because the priest kings will set it on fire. Like, you could do something with the idea of a isekai protagonist being pulled to a world where people are being pulled from and being released in some kind of human preserve and rebelling against the system that people had grown to live with. But this is so not that story. This is clearly a guy going to. I don't even know how to describe this. This is a hot mess in ways I was not prepared for, and I feel like even just focusing on the BDSM stuff undersells just how badly this book is telling its story. It is a mess, and I'm glad I read it because it is fascinating, but for reasons I was not expecting. Yeah, like John Carter has a moral code and loves his space dog, and he rebels against the system. Yeah, exactly. Like, if this had followed that template, it could very easily be doing something interesting, but it is clearly not doing that. He's just basically doing what his dad told him right up to this point. And I get the feeling that he's going to pull a Dune and become the new big bad, but like slightly less bad than the evil than what he's rebelling against, and he's gonna like fight the priest kings or something. Yeah, he does still get the space princess. Well, you gotta have some incentive for the hero to do their thing, obviously. But this was written by a guy who was born in 1931. The first one was in 1966, and the most recent one was written in 2024. This man lived through the majority of the 20th century and a good portion of the 21st century. God only knows how many books he's got left in him, and God only knows where the story even is now. I don't know what to say about this. This didn't wipe me out like Atlanta Knights did, but I feel like if I got further into this, it absolutely would. Because, Lord, do they go hard into that, like, sex slave stuff. And I can just tell the author is just sweating as they put these details on the page. They can't wait to get away from the boring, like, medieval heist stuff and get back to what's happening next. That's the vibe I'm getting from this. Yeah. Most of the 38 Gore books don't even follow this, man. Yeah, yeah, I heard they do kind of change protagonists after a while, and I imagine they'd have to. They couldn't establish that. Probably not, unfortunately, Kirby. As much as I might like to, I feel like some point this would stop being a fun kind of bad and just be bad, and probably best to quit on a high note. Yeah, the series was put on hold after its 25th installment, Magicians of Gore, in 1988, when DAW refused to publish its successor, Witness of Gore. Yeah, yeah. There's been a couple rows with the publisher over the years, and I imagine it's because of the content. Like, I struggle to imagine how this has some, like, philosophy following it, and I have to imagine it's more like a cult or something. Jesus Christ, this fucking thing. So yeah, that is Tarnsman of Gor, the first 5 chapters. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks so much for those who recommended it to me. I am weirdly glad this turned out to be as weird and cursed as I thought it would be, and I am morbidly amused that it was worse in ways I was not expecting. It has been an adventure, and we'll see what other literary trash I can dig up. Maybe I'll dig up one of the later ones and see just how bad it's getting, and see if I can read it on stream without the Twitch cops coming after me. We shall see. I did make the mistake of reading one of the books with a female protagonist, and I have to say the writing somehow actually degraded over time. Oh god. He does one with a female protagonist. That has to be an adventure. I am morbidly curious about this. But yeah, tomorrow night we will be poking at Bioran, which is a mod for the first, second, and third Resident Evil, which bundles them all into a single package for a randomizer. Very curious about this. I've been wanting to show it off for some time. No stream next week since I will be on vacation from Saturday to Saturday, so I will see you all tomorrow and then the following week afterward. So have a good night, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.